Wendy. A distant female voice called. Wendy furrowed her dark brows and sighed. A strand of russet hair shifted and then settled on her open forehead. Her black eyes flickered, and the girl let out a soft groan before falling silent. She dreamt of a chamomile meadow with bright red poppies. Wendy, clad in a long white sundress, floated above the greenery and flowers, her arms fluttering in the air like bird wings. Spinning under the warm rays of the sun, she gazed into the endless grassy sea, where the voice echoed repeatedly, "Wendy, Wendy." Flying towards the voice, she only encountered emptiness. No one. She looked around at the green forest. Maybe there. The voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. "Wendy," echoed right next to her. Wendy jolted and sat up in bed. A lamp on a tall stand illuminated an old worn-out table, a shabby chair, a piece of floor covered in brown linoleum with gaps. The large round clock's hands froze at 2:30 in the night. Wendy grimaced. What a wonderful dream I didn't get to finish. Next to her, Mrs. Lawyer's figure froze. A grey worn-out robe adorned her broad shoulders, and a large blue button hung on a thread over her chest. The old woman's gaze was glassy, like that of a plastic toy. "Go to the 5th ward. There's another mess with that old man," Mrs. Loire said, her large hands slightly swaying, veins bulging ominously in the dim light. Wendy adjusted her hair. She searched for slippers with her feet, picked them up from under the bed, stood up, and reached for her robe. Mrs. Loire snorted. "Well done." Yawning, she shrugged her shoulders and went to the next room to catch some more sleep. Wendy quickly worked along the long hospital corridor. The ward did not please her with its appearance or smell. Dimly flickering old lamps, walls painted with dull green paint, and a noisy old refrigerator near the nurse's station. By morning, a small puddle would form under it, and someone would have to wipe it with a grey rag before rounds. The doors to the rooms were partially open, but it didn't make being inside any easier. Wendy had long learned not to notice the sharp smell of sick people, disinfectant, and human sweat. It was hard not to pay attention to the suffering permeating the air. From each room designed for sick, moans, snores, and sometimes whimpers echoed. Uncomfortable metal beds with thin mattresses creaked under the weight of bodies. Silhouettes of bottles with warm water and forgotten dinner plates darkened on the nightstands. Here's the 5th ward. Lonely old people and homeless individuals were usually placed here. Being in the hospital was unpleasant, and in this one, on the outskirts of the city, even worse. The old 2-story building, constructed in the 60s, long needed renovation, and people referred to it as the Plague House. It looked like a concrete block from the outside. Peeling paint on the facades, swollen window frames, and rusted, sagging roofs were more discouraging than illnesses. Those taken away in ambulances anxiously listened to doctors' conversations to understand if they would be brought to the Plague House for treatment. Only upon hearing 15th on Bear Street would they desperately pull banknotes from their pockets, begging the doctors to take them anywhere else. That's why modest, lonely, and helpless people sought treatment in this hospital. Some managed to leave on their own 2 feet, while others, well, that's just how fate works. The cemetery wasn't far, just across the road. Leaning crosses and overgrown graves behind a low concrete fence didn't contribute to a positive atmosphere for the patients. Wendy cautiously pushed the door. It squeaked softly. In the corner, a mound of dark blankets revealed thin elderly legs sticking out. The indifferent moon peered through the window. How many of such unfortunate souls had it witnessed? Hundreds. Eternity was something the moon understood, but humans feared it, stubbornly clinging to what they called the present. Yet, the present was so fleeting a gust, and it crumbled. Today you're young and healthy, and tomorrow you're a neglected ruin. A quiet groan echoed. The old man was clearly not doing well. Wendy approached the bed. Gently lifting the blanket, she surveyed the emaciated body, damp sheets, a patchy beard she had trimmed just a few days ago. and now it had grown again. "Mr. Corduroy." Wendy touched the old man's shoulder. "Mr. Corduroy, are you asleep?" The old man groaned louder and waved his exhausted hand, as if shooing away a fly, then struggled to open his eyes. In the dim light, they sparkled. Even when Mr. Corduroy first arrived at the hospital, and Wendy took him to the sanitary room for washing and medical care, she noticed how beautiful his not-so-old eyes were. His shiny bald head was adorned with a wreath of long, untrimmed gray hair. He reminded Wendy of some ancient Greek philosopher she had seen in a history textbook, especially when she wrapped him in a hospital sheet. "Hey, who's there?" A hoarse voice sounded. "It's me, Wendy," the girl whispered. There was no one else in the ward. It turned out that Mr. Corduroy was lying here alone. Winter had not yet arrived, so the unfortunate ones who suffered frostbite and ended up in the hospital still slept on benches in the park or sought shelter from the bad weather in basements. Mr. Corduroy had hidden there 3 days ago, warming his chilled fingers by the hot radiator. Then the communal workers arrived and drove everyone out into the pouring rain. A heavy lock was put on the basement door. Mr. Corduroy hoped to wait out the bad weather at the train station. The icy wind and slush did their job. The next day, the old man developed a fever. His back hurt badly, and by evening, he lay at the bus stop right on the asphalt. Few passers-by disdainfully avoided him, mistaking him for a drunk. Only one middle-aged woman stopped, bent down, scrutinized his face, and then called for an ambulance. That's how he ended up in the plague house. "Mr. Corduroy," Wendy called the old man again. "Let me change your sheets and wipe you down." But the man only groaned in response. Wendy put her hand on his forehead. The temperature was high, and the old man was clearly in pain. Kidney stones or inflammation. Who knows? They don't report it to their orderlies. Their job is to wash the patient, change clothes, feed if they're too weak. Without waiting for any response, Wendy turned the old man, changed the sheet, adjusted the blanket, and once again laid a cool palm on his head. Despite the heat, warm threads seemed to weave into Wendy's skin, instantly making her feel good and calm. Wendy smiled, saying, "A strange feeling." It appeared the moment she first touched the old man's hand. She intentionally peeked into his room several times a day. It was as if something drew her here. Just entering, adjusting the pillow, holding his head while giving him a sip of water made her feel lighter. A real kind wizard from a fairy tale. Wendy smiled to herself. Dr. Reed's nitpicking, Mrs. Lawyer's complaints, and her own sore back from the workload were immediately forgotten. She genuinely cared for Mr. Corduroy and felt sorry for him. He looked so lonely within these walls. "I need to go to Denise and ask her to give him a painkiller," Wendy thought and closed the door. Mr. Corduroy continued to breathe heavily. Wendy quickly worked down the corridor to the nurse's room. The door, of course, was locked. She knocked gently silence. Then she knocked harder and, raising her voice, called out, "Denise, Denise, open up. It's me, Wendy." Behind the door, there was a creak, a rustle. After a minute, the door opened, revealing a sleepy and displeased Denise. "What do you want? Completely lost your mind wandering around at night?" "Denise, there's an old man from room 5, Mr. Corduroy. He's groaning a lot, and he has a fever. Check the prescriptions. Maybe you can give him an injection." Denise rubbed her eyes and yawned. "He's not allowed anything. Dr. E didn't leave any instructions. That's it. Don't disturb. Let me get some rest." And she slammed the door. Wendy looked perplexed at the door, once again surprised by the callousness and indifference of those she worked with. Denise was always rude, with both nurses and patients. She yelled at the elderly so loudly that they flinched, shrunk, and tried not to cross her path unnecessarily. But Denise was kind only to one person, her superior. It was rumored that their relationship was not just friendly, and often Denise slipped out of Dr. Reed's office, adjusting her hair on the go and tugging at her robe. The age difference or the appearance of her lover didn't bother her. The short and round head of the department briskly walked around the ward, giving orders. Sometimes he playfully pressed against the young nurses, but he tried to do it in Denise's absence. She was jealous and could throw a full-blown tantrum. In such moments, Dr. Reed blushed, raised his short arms in a pleading gesture, and quickly moved into his office. When Wendy appeared in the ward, Dr. Reed's eyes lit up. Smiling with yellowish teeth, he invited her to come to his office for coffee. "I don't have time," Wendy said shyly. "Oh, come on. Patients aren't going anywhere." And he took her elbow. His hand slid lower, but Wendy recoiled. She rushed out of their office and ran to the utility room, unaware of Denise watching her closely. Denise's deeply small eyes didn't bode well. She knew Reed too well and understood why he summoned this naive girl to his office. In the morning rounds, Wendy decided to tell the head about how bad the night was for the patient. Mr. Corduroy would hardly complain. He was too weak, and his character seemed reserved. But would Dr. Reed listen to her? He had hinted several times for her to linger in his office, and then explicitly suggested not to resist. "For whom are you keeping treasures?" he sarcastically remarked. Wendy remained silent. She felt terribly ashamed and uncomfortable that the respected doctor could stoop so low. "But see for yourself," Dr. Reed said. "I won't persuade you for long. Take it or leave it." Since then, constant nitpicking began. The floor was poorly cleaned. The window wasn't closed. The laundry wasn't delivered on time. And Denise's assignments weren't fulfilled. Patients weren't mentioned in this list of complaints. The head had no concern for them. The main thing was for Wendy to keep up with other tasks, and those who couldn't complain would wait. Wendy understood perfectly well why her relationship with the staff had changed, but she endured, trying to be everywhere. Realizing that Wendy couldn't be broken, Dr. Reed ordered her to take all night shifts and be on duty for all holidays. "So what?" he grinned. "She has neither a kitten nor a child, so let her work." He would gladly have fired Wendy, but there was a shortage of staff, so they had to endure her, and seeing her was difficult. Every time the girl reminded him that he had lost and couldn't tame her, Wendy's fresh face, her figure, her hair, everything continued to stir the man's mind and blood. And Denise? What about Denise? It wasn't the same. Boring. One day, Dr. Reed entered the dressing room without knocking and found Wendy by the locker. She had just come for the shift. Combing her hair, she was getting ready to tie it into a braid or bun again. Watching her, Dr. Reed gasped. Imagination immediately painted Wendy naked. He imagined burying his nose in the fragrant locks, almost mewling. Wendy turned around frightened and paled. She probably saw the burning passion in his sick eyes. Dr. Reed said nothing, just smoothed the remnants of his hair with a sweaty palm, then turned and left, slamming the door loudly. The hospital continued to live its life. Old lamps hummed quietly on the ceiling. The refrigerator rattled. Wendy understood she couldn't fall asleep. Thoughts about the poor old man haunted her. Strange. And why did he get so under her skin? She returned to the 5th ward. The old man groaned quietly, as if sensing he wasn't alone. Wendy felt his forehead. Hot. What should I do to alleviate his condition in some way? She moistened a towel and applied it to his head. Gently, she smoothed his gray hair. There was no irritation or awkwardness. It felt like she was taking care of her grandfather. A thought flickered in her mind. She had no grandfather. No one. She was alone in this world. Initially, there was happiness, and then there was nothing. They say children don't understand themselves well before 5, but that's untrue. Wendy remembered every moment of her short and happy childhood. Mom, Dad, Grandma Rita, the cat Fluffy, and Goldfinch Sylvester. Her world, her little paradise. She lived with her parents in an old wooden house with a high carved roof and a little balcony. Mom worked at the library, and Dad was an engineer at the optical instruments factory. Wendy remembered how her dad carried her on his shoulders from kindergarten, and she hugged a bag of candies. At home, her mom awaited them with rosy pies. The teapot was already on the table, and an entire evening of board games and songs with a guitar awaited them. Mom's voice was not loud but clear, and Dad's was resonant. So much laughter and joy filled their home. Wendy hugged her parents around the neck, closing her eyes, savoring their love. Everything collapsed that night when Wendy stayed overnight at Grandma Rita's, and a terrible fire broke out in their house. Mom and Dad perished, and so did Fluffy the cat and Goldfinch Sylvester. The old wiring short-circuited, and the parents couldn't escape. 5-year-old Wendy remained with her grief-stricken grandmother. In one evening, she lost her only son and daughter-in-law. A few months later, Grandma found the strength to go to the ruins. She sat on a miraculously surviving bench near the jasmine bushes, embraced her head with her hands, and wept. Little Wendy, with frightened widened eyes, stared at the dreadful black ruins, feeling like an evil sorceress from a fairy tale had flown here and enchanted everything, turning it lifeless. Mom and Dad managed to transform into white swans and flew away, but they couldn't return for their daughter because the witch was stronger. They needed to wait, and Wendy patiently waited. They were about to leave with Grandma when Wendy clumsily stepped on a burnt plank. It cracked. Grandma grabbed Wendy's hand in fear, and a chod ring jumped out from under their feet. Grandma leaned down and picked it up. Stella's ring. She cried. It came to Stella from her mother. Looking at the unattractive ring, Wendy didn't believe Grandma. Her mother wore a different one, shiny, with a blue gem and an inscription inside. "This is your great-great-grandmother's ring, dear." Her mom caressed her head. "This is a keepsake. I'll give it to you later. You need to wait." Oh, how Wendy hated that word wait. Wait until your birthday. Wait until Christmas. Wait for summer. But now she agreed to wait for 1,000 years if only Mom and Dad would stop being swans and come back to her. "And do you have my grandfather's rings?" she asked, trying on the ring. The ring dangled and slipped off the thin pinky. Mom didn't answer the question. She just shook her head, and sadness filled her blue eyes. Grandma Rita, as best she could, cleaned the ring. Inside, the inscription became distinguishable again, 1880, and then either an 8 or a 9, unclear. The ring was kept in a black velvet pouch, and 3 months later, Grandma was gone. Her heart couldn't beat. The pouch with the ring ended up with a distant relative, and Wendy went to an orphanage. It wasn't good or bad there. It was just indifferent. Like her enchanted princess, she patiently waited for the witch's spell to dissipate and her old life to return. Tears tried to bother Wendy, but she just looked at them with a cold gaze. Soon, they left her alone. "Not of this world, girl," everyone said. Wendy went to the library, reminiscing about sitting at her mom's workplace surrounded by shelves of books and magazines. Her mom would hand her an album with magical fairy tale pictures, and Wendy would quietly flip through the glossy pages, marveling in admiration. The library was warm, and the scent of books filled the air. Red fire extinguisher canisters were scattered everywhere, making Wendy wonder why her mom, so protective of books, didn't protect herself. If only they had at least one fire extinguisher at home, maybe her parents could have survived. Wendy excelled in her studies, and there were suggestions for her to enter medical college. But the scholarship was meager, barely enough to live on. After leaving the orphanage, the question of accommodation arose. Director Mr. Sullivan helped Wendy rent a small apartment, but in another small town built around one of the factories. An uninteresting, depressing town. That's how Wendy ended up here. She completed nursing courses and got a job at the hospital in their infectious diseases ward. After leaving the orphanage, she visited distant relatives and, with little hope, inquired about the ring. Aunt Danny, aged and completely gray, brought out a velvet pouch. With trembling fingers, Wendy took out the ring and placed it on her palm. The blue stone didn't brighten. It became even grayer, as if it contained sorrow within itself. It turned Grandma's face the same way after the tragedy. But the stone endured, and Grandma didn't. Wendy took the memory of her mom and left. She had to try to live somehow. The old man coughed, and Wendy seemed to wake up. She didn't like to dwell on the past. It made her want to cry immediately. And now this long night and a feeling of helplessness. In the morning, I'll go straight to Dr. Reed. This can't go on. Wendy frowned. The white coat and eyes glowing with kindness made her look like an angel descended from the heavens, but unable to protect. Finally, the gloomy and melancholic morning arrived. The ward gradually woke up and came to life. An annoyed Denise walked through the corridor, shouting at patients, opening ward doors, and mercilessly turning on the bright light. However, the patients closed their eyes, grimacing with parched mouths, preparing for their usual dose of personal injections and pills. Patients endured painful shots from irritated Denise, wincing and combed through spots dried overnight, visible through pajamas and gowns. Dr. Reed arrived around 9 in the morning. By that time, the ward had breakfasted and hushed, awaiting the formidable doctor. Denise finished her shift but didn't go home. She rushed to the shower on the second floor and now, steaming, sat in the nurse's office, waiting for Reed. Wendy, pale after a sleepless night, quickly mopped the floor, hoping to have a minute with the head. It seemed to her that he just didn't know how bad it was for their old man in the 5th ward. In the morning, she once again changed his bedding, wiped his face and chest with a towel, and even asked the cafeteria lady to add sugar to his tea. She cut a slice of lemon and tried to give Mr. Corduroy a sip. He was conscious but confused. Only his dark eyes slightly cleared when Wendy persuaded him to take a sip. He drank a little but coughed. Having finished cleaning, she waited until the head of the department would come out into the corridor after his rounds. Dr. Reed. She called to him. The man turned around. Upon seeing Wendy, his eyebrows raised, and an unpleasant smirk appeared on his face. Had she changed her mind? Yes, Wendy. Good morning, he replied, approaching. I would like to inquire about the patient in the 5th ward. He had a fever all night and was clearly in pain. I changed his bedding and saw it. He's not doing well. Denise said there are no orders, but he needs treatment. Dr. Reed irritably pursed his lips and said, Since when do I have to report to a nurse? Who is he to you? A relative? No, Wendy replied, blushing. But, so, focus on your direct duties. Patients will be taken care of by licensed specialists. Dr. Reed smoothed a strand of hair on his bald head and smirked self-satisfied. She started talking and daring. How can we persuade her? Suddenly, a brilliant idea struck him. He glanced at Wendy, licked his lips, and approached her, almost pressing her against the wall. Wendy sensed a faint scent of citrus. Leaning in, almost touching her cheek, Dr. Reed whispered, But if you, Wendy, feel sorry for some tramp, maybe we can discuss how to help him in my office. Wendy pressed herself against the wall and turned away. She found both his breath and his lips repulsive, along with his indecent suggestions. She shook her head, slipped out from under him, and almost ran down the corridor. The shift was over. It was time to go home, but Wendy couldn't bring herself to leave the hospital. She went to Mr. Corduroy again, adjusted his pillow, tried to give him a drink, but the old man either slept or pretended to, showing no reaction to her touch. He only breathed heavily and tightly pressed his lips. Wendy had noticed before that Dr. Reed paid almost no attention to these unwanted patients, prescribing the most basic treatments, if anything, on paper. The saved expensive medicines mysteriously disappeared. Where to? Denise probably knew. After sitting by the bed for a few minutes, Wendy sighed, stood up, and was about to leave when she heard the old man's quiet whisper, Daughter, it hurts. Where? Where does it hurt? Wendy leaned toward Mr. Corduroy's face. Everywhere. Daughter. Everywhere. It's staring. Burning all over. Wendy hesitated for a moment, but after just a few seconds, she rushed out of the room. All her modesty and shyness seemed to evaporate. She walked down the corridor with determined steps, opened the door to the head's office without knocking. Her cheeks burned with indignation. Dr. Reed wasn't alone. 2 more doctors S80 at the table. Together, they all stayed in surprise at the nurse who burst into their office. Dr. Reed, Wendy began, then turned her gaze to another doctor. The patient in the 5th ward is in really bad shape. He's in pain. If you don't help him right now, I'll file a complaint with the Ministry of Health, she said. You're not treating him. Their office fell silent. Both doctors lowered their eyes and started examining their folded hands on the table. Dr. Reed got angry. Get out. Who are you? Dr. Braun, he said, addressing one of the doctors, as if asking him to throw her out. I won't leave. Wendy's knees trembled with fear and excitement. Dr. Reed widened his eyes and was about to shout when suddenly Dr. Braun looked sympathetically at Wendy and said, I'll go take a look. Dr. Reed, do you mind? Without waiting for an answer, he stood up from the table. Wendy immediately followed him, as if afraid he might change his mind or the head would now forbid any movement. Silently, they reached the 5th ward. Dr. Braun examined the old man, called the duty nurse, and gave short and swift instructions. 5 minutes later, she was administering a shot to Mr. Corduroy. 15 minutes later, the old man felt better, and his groans subsided. Wendy was ready to hug the young doctor. He had recently joined the department. Thank you. Thank you. She thanked him. Dr. Braun looked embarrassed. No problem. Is he someone you know? No, he's just a patient. Seems like he has no one. The man looked at the bewildered face of the girl in surprise. Amazing. So beautiful. Yet working as a nurse. Who among the young and beautiful would agree to this now? You have a kind soul, Wendy. Dr. Braun smiled. Don't worry. Go and rest. You had the night shift. I've made all the prescriptions. Prescribed medicines from the latest range of antibiotics. See, for some reason, he showed Wendy a sheet where the name was quite legible. Wendy blushed, smiled shyly in response, took another look at their old man, and left. She rode home with a light heart. Opening the door to her apartment in the building, Wendy listened. The dark corridor was lit by only one dim light bulb. Not hearing the usual drunken shouts and curses from her neighbor, Wendy sighed with relief and entered their apartment. There were only 4 apartments in the building. In this 2-story old house, painted yellow, lived generally unhappy people. Wendy lived modestly and quietly, unnoticed, like a mouse in a burrow. She often worked shifts and, in moments of rest, read, embroidered, or simply slept. Every time she went to bed, she awaited her mother and father in her dreams, hoping they would come to her on white swans and take her to a place of happiness. The next morning, she had to go back to her shift. The window showed a fine rain, a cold wind, and gloomy gray clouds hanging directly overhead. Wendy hurried to the hospital. She really wanted to see Mr. Corduroy and make sure the medications helped, and he was feeling better. Wendy changed into her uniform and rushed to the 5th ward. Even as she approached the door, she heard muffled moans. Her heart beat faster. Could the old man be so bad that their antibiotic didn't help him? Mr. Corduroy lay twisted, the sheet slipping almost to the floor. The water glass overturned, and the old man's lips had turned pale from thirst and pain. Wendy set about tidying him up. On her way to her shift, she stopped by the store and bought a large bottle of water, a couple of yogurts, a banana. But now she understood that their old man wouldn't eat anything except water. He drank it eagerly. What on earth is going on? Wendy almost cried. At the nurse's station, Denise S80 at the table, lazily flipping through a magazine. Denise, Wendy leaned toward her, exasperated. Did the patient in the 5th ward get his medication? Dr. Braun prescribed it. Oh, you're so annoying with your homeless guy. Denise replied, enough already. Dr. Eid cancelled all the prescriptions. Using such an expensive medication on him. She disdainfully pursed her lips. If you want, take him home and treat him as much as you want. But don't mess with normal people. Go mop the floors already. She yelled. Wendy remained silent. Went to the utility room for buckets and mops. Throughout the day, she contemplated how to help Mr. Corduroy. She tried to find Dr. Braun, but he had gone on vacation. She found another doctor, but he, after listening, mumbled that he wasn't authorized to go against the hospital director's recommendations and fled into the doctor's lounge. Out of helplessness, she wanted to shout, "He will die. His heart won't withstand it, or his kidneys will fail. Can this be allowed?" Wendy thought. Deep down, she already understood that no one would help, but her brain refused to believe it. Evening came. The patients gradually went to bed. Wendy mechanically performed her duties, changing the beddings, wiping the floor, and ventilating the wards. She only thought about how to help Mr. Corduroy. The thought of buying the medicine herself briefly crossed her mind, but it was insanely expensive, and Wendy was already stretching her pennies until her next paycheck. Besides, you couldn't get it without a prescription. Just as she finished her evening cleaning, a sinister thought came to her. She needed to take the medicine from the cabinet at night. No one would notice several packs missing. In surprise, Wendy even looked around. It seemed like their entire ward heard this terrible plan. She had never taken anything that didn't belong to her. What would her mom and dad say? Out of shame, Wendy even closed her eyes, as if her parents stood in front of her, asking, "How could you think of such a thing, daughter?" However, the intrusive thought refused to disappear, and no matter how much Wendy tried to convince herself, her certainty that it was their only way only grew. She couldn't watch calmly as their unfortunate old man faded away. Wendy didn't believe in God. How could she believe in him when he didn't save her parents and condemned the girl to orphanhood? But she always knew that there was something powerful and vast, calling it the universe, and believed that it defined what was good and what was bad. There is falsehood for the greater good, so there must be sin for salvation. Wendy remembered that Denise was on duty today, and she never left the key in the drawer at the station. She always took it with her. Once a night, she did get up to administer injections to those who needed pain relief on the schedule. To do this, she opened the safe where potent drugs were stored, so the key stays in the box in the nurse's office. Usually, it remains there until morning. Wendy's fingers were freezing. It means she can quietly take the key at around 3 in the morning and return it back in the morning. Denise quickly administers the injections and immediately goes to sleep, unlikely to check the contents of the box. "What are you doing here?" A voice came from the side. Wendy jumped. Denise, as if she guessed what Wendy was thinking. Denise, suspiciously squinting her eyes, stared at her intently. What's on her mind? Is she praying? Their eyes looked pure, innocent. Night fell. Wendy checked on their old man again. He was still in bad shape. With a heavy heart, she went to the utility room. She couldn't sleep, and she wouldn't. Nervous tremors ran through her as if she had chills due to excitement. She tried reading a book, then solving a crossword puzzle. But, realizing she couldn't concentrate, she stood up and walked to the window. Autumn outside the window. Wendy stared at her reflection and saw only a silhouette and big frightened eyes. "Why are you doing this to yourself? What if Denise catches you red-handed? There will be shame. She will try to tell the whole hospital that she caught a thief." Wendy felt scared. How awful it is to be alone. No one will help, advise, protect, or shelter. And why does she care so much about the fate of some homeless man? It was 12:30. The hands on the clock moved slowly. The girl waited patiently. Finally, around 2:45, She heard shuffling in the corridor. Denise's gait is unmistakable. After waiting for a few seconds, Wendy cautiously cracked the door and peeked through the gap. No one. Only the distant noise of Denise preparing for procedures. Wendy quickly slipped out of the utility room, her heart pounding, a lump in her throat. Wendy sighed and rushed forward. She worked as if afraid she might change her mind, turn around, and run away. Here's the door. Inside, there's a dim light. 2 steps to the table, a second to grab the key, and 2 steps back. What if Denise catches you on your way back? Wendy shook her head, trying not to panic. Whatever will be, will be. It's too late to retreat. She pushed the door sharply. 1 step, another. Fingers hovered over the box with the metal key at the bottom. Wendy quickly snatched it and tucked it into the pocket of her robe. It felt like a dream. She took a step toward the door and only then heard Denise returning down the corridor. In horror, Wendy froze. Out of fear, she scanned the room, searching for a place to hide. But there was nowhere to hide, except to climb into the closet or under the bed. But that would be foolish. Wendy closed her eyes, preparing for disgrace. Denise's footsteps seemed deafening. A meter left, half a meter, a few centimeters. Wendy stopped breathing. Sweaty palms clenched the key in her pocket. The door handle moved, creaking, and cracked open. Wendy wanted to scream from the tension. Denise. Suddenly, Mrs. Lawyer's voice echoed. Come here. You missed the 7th ward. Oh, come on, Mrs. Lawyer. Denise said, I've already closed the safe and written everything down. The door opened a little more, and now you could see the edge of the robe and a thick leg in rubber slippers. Go, Mrs. Lawyer said, or I'll complain to the chief physician tomorrow. Mrs. Lawyer shouted. Yeah, I'm going. I'm going, Denise said displeased. Wendy listened to the footsteps moving away and couldn't believe her luck. Saved. For safety. She waited another minute and only then dared to crack the door open. She hid around the corner and went down the stairs. She absolutely didn't want to meet Denise. By her frightened look, only a blind person wouldn't guess that she had done something. Fearing the consequences, Wendy waited on the stairs for 40 minutes. Of course, Denise had long since returned and was probably asleep, but she didn't want to take any risks. Deciding it was safe, she worked down the corridor like a ghost. At the medicine cabinet, she glanced around again. All clear. She cautiously unlocked it and scanned the shelves of medicines. White boxes with red letters were neatly stacked on top of each other. Wendy smiled. She was afraid she wouldn't find the medicine she needed. She carefully took out one package and put it in the pocket of her robe, then thought for a moment and took another one. A noise echoed in the corridor. Wendy's heart raced. She quickly turned around, but it turned out to be a door slightly ajar due to a draft. She locked it and, pouring a glass of water, hurriedly worked to the 5th ward. The old man had a fever again. He breathed heavily but didn't groan. Wendy read the instructions again and squeezed out a large tablet onto her palm. Realizing that Mr. Corduroy wouldn't be able to swallow it, she dissolved it in water. A pleasant raspberry scent reminded her of the chewing gum her dad used to buy for her. After the old man took the medicine, he became calmer and fell asleep half an hour later. Wendy, too, dozed off, lowering her head onto the table by the window. At 6 in the morning, she woke up abruptly, as if someone had called or nudged her. She looked at the clock. Shouts from Denise were already audible from the depths of the department. Wendy approached the bed. Mr. Corduroy was sound asleep. He breathed almost without wheezing, and his face cleared. She touched his forehead. The skin was damp, but there was no fever. All the worries and doubts she had experienced evaporated. She had done everything right. The medicine works, and that's the main thing. With a light heart, Wendy left the ward and started her usual duties. Throughout the day, she checked on Mr. Corduroy several more times. She will give him the next tablet in the evening. Thank you, dear, The old man smiled when Wendy helped him with lunch. "Bless you. Just take care of yourself." Wendy blushed, happy that Mr. Corduroy was gradually coming back to life. "Now I'll recover." Luckily, the doctor took pity and prescribed the medicine. I heard him grumbling that there's no point in spending taxes on people like me. But I wasn't always like this. The old man suddenly justified himself. "Don't think about it," Wendy said, looking around to make sure no one was listening. "You rest, and I'll come by again soon." She was about to leave when a dry, warm hand grabbed her arm. "Thank you, Wendy. My wife had the same name." The old man sighed heavily. Wendy froze. A wonderful feeling of peace and joy enveloped her again. She didn't want to leave, but she quietly smiled and hurried into the corridor. In the evening after dinner, she again dissolved the medicines in water and, leaving one more tablet, told him to take it himself in the morning. Denise caught Mr. Corduroy in the act. She looked into the ward just when he patiently waited for the tablet to dissolve. He thought about breaking it in half again and taking it that way, but decided to do it the way Wendy did. "What are you mixing here?" Denise asked rudely, staring suspiciously at the somewhat murky liquid. "Will you poison yourself?" She grabbed the glass and stuck her nose in, sniffing. "So, it's an antibiotic. Where did you get it?" she asked menacingly. "Where did you get it?" I ask. "So, the doctor prescribed it, and the nurse started giving it to me." "Which doctor? What nurse?" Dennis widened her eyes. Mr. Corduroy fell silent, helplessly gesturing with his hands. He lowered his head and cursed himself with the last words. He shouldn't have said anything at all. Now this stout woman is yelling at him, and she'll probably take away the medicines. Denise, realizing she wouldn't get anything from the old man, turned around, still holding the glass, and went to the nurse's station. There, she placed it on the table, almost spilling the water, and hurriedly opened the medicine cabinet. Just as she suspected, 2 packs were missing. "Dr. Reed!" She shouted loudly. "Dr. Reed!" She ran towards the head doctor's office. He came out on hearing her voice. Denise was calling him too loudly. Maybe there was an emergency. God forbid, someone fell out of a window or something. "What?" he asked anxiously. He worked hurriedly down the corridor towards her. Denise exhaled and began to tell him what she had found. The head doctor listened attentively. Having finished with Denise, Dr. Reed went to the 5th ward. Mr. Corduroy continued to sit in the same pose. Amidst the turmoil caused by the medicine, he already understood that something bad had happened. And the worst part was that it was his fault. "Where did you get this?" the head doctor asked the old man. "Wendy gave it to him, Dr. Reed. She was on duty at night and ran in here all the time." "Wait, what about the key?" Suddenly, the head doctor turned around. "You should have the key." Denise widened her eyes, blushed, and suddenly said, "Maybe she made a duplicate. Imagine how much medicine she's take already. Probably reselling it, and we have a shortage." "Oh." The woman got scared and covered her mouth with her hand. Dr. Reed glared at her with malice. "Write me an explanation and call Wendy urgently. We'll conduct an internal investigation." "I found these tablets," Mr. Corduroy's voice suddenly sounded. "I felt unwell, and they were at the post, on the table, so I decided to drink them. No one gave them to me. I stole them, took them from the table myself." "Your attempt to defend the hospital employee is commendable," Dr. Reed sarcastically said, "but it's useless. We'll handle it ourselves." He grabbed the doorknob and said to Denise, "Continue the treatment the same way since." He didn't finish his sentence and, waving his hand, went into their office. Images of Wendy, tearful and pleading not to be fired, flashed in his mind, willing to get closer to him. Even sinful thoughts made him feel hot. What luck that she made such a mistake. An hour later, Wendy knocked on Dr. Reed's office door. "Come in," his voice sounded. Wendy took a deep breath, opened the door, and entered. To her surprise, the head doctor was alone in the office. "Well, Wendy," he said kindly, rising from his desk. "Come in. Let's talk about your little pranks. I hope you won't resist. You've committed theft. It's very serious. I haven't involved the police yet. Maybe we can settle this ourselves." "Ha. What do you think?" Wendy stood there with her head down. Dr. Reed approached closer and, unable to resist, ran his trembling fingers over her skin. The girl flinched. The man walked to the door and turned the lockbolt. "So, what do you say? We can bury this matter. You just need to be more cooperative." Dr. Reed pursed his lips and extended them toward her face. She recoiled. Probably, if a cold slug had crawled over her skin, it wouldn't have been as repulsive. Dr. Reed noticed it. His upper lip twitched in irritation. "Well then," he said and moved back to the table. Dialing the head doctor's number, he briefly explained the situation. Wendy, frozen in horror, watched him with tearful eyes. Oh God, what a disgrace. She wanted to sink deep into the ground. Then everything became blurry. The table around which the heads, doctors, and someone from the administrative department gathered. Wendy remembered a not-so-young woman who looked at her sympathetically, saying something about resigning voluntarily. But Dr. Reed vehemently disagreed. In the end, she received a settlement and was dismissed for a breach of trust. A day later, when Wendy hurried in the early morning to collect her remaining belongings from the locker, she saw her photo on the notice board near the reception with a caption that read, "Shame of the entire team." Denise was standing there, explaining something to the people gathered around her. They noticed Wendy and began scrutinizing her as if she were an animal in a zoo. The girl blushed and quickly turned towards the stairs. Her eyes were filled with tears. What was she guilty of? What did she do to deserve all this? "You're a nasty, Denise," Mrs. Loire exclaimed. "Watch out. Don't choke on your own venom." She followed Wendy into the changing room. A minute later, she was gently stroking Wendy's head with her palm. "Don't worry, dear. Don't cry. Your old man is getting better now. They're giving him medication. So, you saved him. God sees everything. It'll count for something." And she hugged Wendy to her chest again. "Where is this God of yours?" Wendy thought angrily. Where? He never existed. Otherwise, Mom and Dad would be alive. Grandma wouldn't be lying abandoned. And that scoundrel wouldn't be bothering me. There was so much bitterness in her soul. And the injustice of it all hurt the most. "Here, take this," Mrs. Loire handed Wendy a paper-wrapped bundle. Take it. And don't you dare refuse." Her words sounded rough, but Wendy knew the woman's exterior was deceiving. She hadn't had an easy life either. Wendy understood that there were money in the bundle and didn't know how to refuse so that Mrs. Loire wouldn't be offended. The woman forcefully put it into Wendy's hands. This time, Wendy cried again, but this time it was tears of gratitude. "Go somewhere, dear. Go far away. That scoundrel won't let you live peacefully here. No hospital will take you in this town. Look elsewhere. And when you get back on your feet, learn something. Go to college or become a master's. You're young, beautiful, smart. Most importantly, you're kind, with a pure heart. I'll pray for you, that God sends you happiness." She patted Wendy on the back. "All right, Wendy," she said warmly, giving her a tight hug. "Go on, I'll look after the old man. Don't worry, you have nothing to be ashamed of. Lift your head high and go. Let them all die of envy." Wendy hugged the warm woman tightly once again, thanked her, and kissed her soft cheek. She left, while Mrs. Loire sighed and headed downstairs. There, she pushed aside the giggling nurses and attendants, shoved Denise with her shoulder, and abruptly took down the announcement with Wendy's photo from the wall. Denise opened her mouth to protest, but Mrs. Loire gave her such an unfriendly look that she fell silent. The others, also silenced, hurried about their business. Mr. Corduroy waited for Wendy all day. Anxiously, he glanced at the door, hoping to hear its creak, and his heart leaped with joy. He wanted so much to see Wendy's kind face again. He had grown accustomed to her, as to a close relative. But instead of her, a woman entered the room. Without uttering a word, she started cleaning the floor. The silent Mr. Corduroy pulled the blanket higher. The medicine was helping him. He could now work to the bathroom on his own, and his appetite had returned. He was only troubled by the scandal with the pills, and Wendy seemed to be involved in it too. The old man blamed himself for being so careless, but who could have known? Now he worried why Wendy hadn't come anymore. Was she offended? She cared so much for him, and he, an old man, let her down. He deserved to be upset. Let it be. The main thing was that she wouldn't face any trouble because of him. Excuse me. He finally decided to address the woman in the blue robe. Do you know where Nurse Wendy is, Mrs. Noir looked at the old man, paused, and replied, because of you, the girl got fired. She left, resigned, she said. Mr. Corduroy flinched. Something terrible had happened. Because of him, all this happened. He sat on the bed, slid his legs down, and began searching for his slippers. Something needed to be done, some way to help her. He had to go to the head, write a complaint what was happening. How was this possible? Don't make a fuss here, the cleaner said. It's all done. Your main task is to get better. I promise to look after you and pray for the girl's health. If not for her, you would have died a long time ago. The next morning, the whole hospital was in turmoil. By 8 o'clock, Dr. Reed appeared in a white coat, walking down the corridor, giving orders. The attendants and cleaners were washing the floors and walls. Nurses were tidying up the stations and rooms. Patients were arranged in their beds, and a warning was issued that their old fridge would be thrown out, and privileges would be revoked if anyone left food on the bedside table. Staff removed worn-out blankets and sheets, stashing them away in the storage room. In return, they were given new linens, and those who could manage to make their beds, wondering about the unexpected stroke of luck. The department buzzed like a disturbed beehive, yet no one knew exactly what caused all this commotion. Eventually, it became known that the mayor of the city was scheduled for an unplanned visit around lunchtime. A surprise, one might say. Everyone froze. The mayor indeed arrived, albeit a bit later than lunch. All the patients lay still during the post-lunch rest. They barely breathed on the clean, new sheets and pillowcases, wondering if they would be taken off after the mayor's visit or left permanently. The administration deliberately chose to visit the plague house, knowing full well what was happening in that hospital. With elections coming up in the spring, Mr. Quinlan, aspiring for a second term as mayor, wanted to promise increased funding on camera and, in the summer, initiate major renovations and procure new equipment by selecting a place with more significant issues and challenges. How it will actually turn out there is unknown. He would gladly help, but there are always numerous buts. Nevertheless, a hospital visit would serve as an excellent PR move, and future voters would likely cast their ballots for him. The hospital staff, in particular, could receive funds for a bonus. Mr. Quinlan was accompanied by a whole entourage, the chief physician and heads of departments. Camera operators zoomed in on the mayor's concerned face as he attentively listened to requests, gave orders to his assistants, and surveyed the peeling walls and old windows. Shaking his head, Mr. Quinlan ascended to the second floor. He wanted to visit the ward, talk to the electorate, reassure patients that they would soon receive treatment in improved conditions. Dr. Reed froze, licked his dry lips, and began opening doors, hoping the mayor would be satisfied with inspecting one or at most two rooms. The patients obediently stayed still in their beds. Mr. Quinlan was tireless. He sat on a chair, peered out the windows, and planned to inquire if anyone had complaints or wishes. Eventually, he moved on down the corridor, precisely towards the abandoned Fifth Ward, where they didn't bother maintaining order much, hoping that the higher-ups wouldn't venture there. "What do we have here?" he inquired. "It's just a ward. One patient is being treated from the less fortunate, but we provide qualified assistance to everyone, regardless of their status," Dr. Reed explained. "So there can be no complaints." Mr. Quinlan looked at the huddled-up patient. Mr. Carteroy didn't lift his gaze. He cowered before the big boss. So many people were following him, and there was even television. He wished he could recover faster, find out from the janitor where Wendy lived, and go thank her and apologize for how things turned out. If there was anything else he could do to help, he would. But what could he offer? Mr. Carteroy stared at the well-cleaned linoleum, at the shining polished boots of the authorities. The mayor surveyed the ward and, turning to the camera, smiled. "No, of course, repairs are needed, and repairs will be done, I promise." "Here, Mr. Carteroy," the hospital administrator reminded the mayor, peeking at the papers. "Yes, dear Mr. Carteroy will confirm. I promise to allocate funds for the hospital's renovation." And then Mr. Quinlan fell silent. With a gesture, he signaled to turn off the camera and suddenly turned towards Mr. Carteroy, furrowing his brow. Several seconds passed. The whole entourage stayed silent, praying that the mayor wouldn't cause a scene. Why else would he look so attentively at this old man with gray hair? "Mr. Carteroy," Mr. Quinlan suddenly asked, "Allow me, but..." And then the mayor smiled, as if he had met a long-lost relative. "Mr. Carteroy, it's you. You taught us math at secondary school number 2, from the 6th grade to the graduation, and you handled geometry. Oh, I received a lot from you." The man laughed. "Tom Quinlan." He finally pronounced it. "You are articulate but lazy." "Yes, Mr. Carteroy, you always used to say it just like that. To me and my parents. You'll need math, Quinlan." The mayor pointed a finger, reminding the teacher of his own words. Mr. Carteroy weakly smiled. It's something, his student becoming such a high official. It seemed that his more than 40 years of work at school were not in vain. Not in vain. He had nurtured so many doctors, engineers, scientists. He even thought he had raised his daughter right. "How delighted I am to meet you." Mr. Quinlan opened his arms, but then he seemed to hit an obstacle. He scanned the gloomy green walls, frowned at the shabby iron bed and chair. Surprised, he raised his eyebrows, looking at where the elderly man and distinguished teacher were situated. He turned to the hospital administrator in confusion. "Excuse me. Why is the patient in such conditions?" "Well, everyone here is in the same situation." Dr. Reed tried to come up with an excuse, breaking into a cold sweat. "No repairs, as you know." "So, I know about the repairs," Mr. Quinlan replied. "But in other wards, you managed to tidy up. And here, what is this?" The mayor pointed disdainfully at the hole-ridden blanket covering the mattress. "And why is this elderly man with health problems in a cold ward?" "Well, the windows are old," the administrator replied. "We are doing our best, considering there's no funding." "Don't hide behind funding," Mr. Quinlan said. "Even in such conditions, one can live with dignity." "And you?" Everyone in the room froze, waiting. Dr. Reed nervously swallowed and pleaded with his eyes for the old man not to complain about the poor treatment he had received. Or more precisely, not received initially, as it could cost him his job. "Immediately transfer Mr. Carteroy to another hospital. I'll personally oversee it. Start an unscheduled inspection here tomorrow. Extensive and serious, or else." The mayor turned to the hospital administrator and chief physician. "I have many questions. This is unacceptable." He waved his hands in frustration. The next day, Mr. Carteroy found himself in completely heavenly conditions in a separate comfortable ward. The chief physician personally examined him, and meals were brought right to his bed. Mr. Carteroy cherished the phone number of his student, Now the mayor. As soon as he felt better, he would find out where Wendy lived and restore justice. Wendy surveyed her gloomy apartment, where everything was neat but too poor. It was true. What's the use of not harming anyone? Misfortunes kept falling on her head. Maybe Mrs. Loire was right, and it was worth leaving. But where? Wendy counted her money. It was not much, but if spent wisely, it would be enough for tickets and a modest apartment. Perhaps she could find a job with accommodation. Wendy had seen a similar job advertisement. What if she got lucky? She looked at her reflection in the mirror of their old wardrobe and gave a faint smile. Luck? No, it's not about me. Curling up, she lay down on the couch and fell silent. She was dreaming again of a chamomile field. And finally, she saw two swans. It turned out they were on a lake hidden behind the forest. Their white silhouettes swayed on the water, and suddenly, one of the swans flapped its wings, shaking off transparent drops, and swiftly soared into the air. And in a moment, Wendy saw that it was her mom. Young, beautiful, and slightly sad. One of her hands remained human, while the other remained a wing. It seemed like she was pointing the way for her daughter. Gradually, the wing melted in the air, turning into a snow trail trodden in the sky. Her mom's appearance also blurred, faded, and soon only her tender voice remained. Wendy. Wendy woke up. Silence filled their apartment. The clock on the bedside table ticked quietly. The old phone showed 4 in the morning. She went to the kitchen and put the kettle on the stove. The kettle boiled quietly. She had tea with a sandwich, eating 2 mint cookies she loved since childhood. Dad didn't mind going to the father's store to get fresh cookies for his daughter. Wendy suddenly decided on an action, just like back in the hospital when she thought of taking medicine without asking. Thinking about Mr. Corduroy made her heart ache. How is he doing? Sighing, Wendy surveyed the apartment. She would take only the essentials with her, and if anything, she could always come back. She decided to move to the neighboring big city. Finding a job would be easier there. She counted her money once again. Thanks to Mrs. Loire, without her gift, things would have been much tougher. Packing some things into a travel bag, she waited until 7 in the morning and left the house. She walked to the station. Passing by the plague house, she searched the windows for the 5th ward. She wanted to see Mr. Corduroy's kind eyes again. She held no grudge against him. She wholeheartedly wished him a full recovery. The main thing was that he would receive help afterward and wouldn't end up on the streets again. Why did he become so close to her? Probably because he was also lonely, just like her. It's difficult to be alone. She bought a ticket. Departure in 2 hours. Wendy considered it a good sign since she didn't know the schedule in advance. The rainy autumn day wept as if bidding farewell to Wendy, but she didn't feel sad. On the contrary, anticipation of the trip that was supposed to change her life enveloped her soul. Here is the 7th carriage. They say 7 is a lucky number. Funny enough, the seat was also the 7th. Wendy placed her bag under the seat, lifted her legs, and moved closer to the window. The rain obscured the view of the platform, but she could see those bidding farewell under umbrellas, passengers awkwardly pushing bags and suitcases, embracing one last time, and hastily boarding the train. The conductor passed through the aisle, checking if everything was in order. The train slowly gained speed. Brick buildings, depots, and wagons flashed by the windows. Passengers settled in unhurriedly. Only after that did they make themselves comfortable to gaze at the passing melancholic autumn landscape. They were comforted by the realization that the rain and wind remained outside, and inside the carriage, it was warm and cozy, and soon they would arrive in their hometowns. Wendy listened to herself. There was no sadness. That's when she realized she had done everything right. The unknown was frightening, of course, but moving forward reassured her. For the first time in her life, the girl didn't obediently wait to see where the current would take her, but decided to try and shape her destiny. Swaying to the rhythm of the train, She imagined that on both sides, two white wings supported her, like swans or perhaps angels. 2 hours later, a woman entered the carriage at a major station and took a seat opposite. She wasn't young. You could estimate her age at around 60. A round face almost without wrinkles. Smoothly combed hair pulled back into a voluminous bun. Judy. She introduced herself, glancing at everyone. Help yourselves. She placed a paper bag on the table, emitting the delicious scent of freshly baked goods. She had baked in the morning. Everything was fresh. Don't be shy. Take some, the woman said to Wendy. Wendy cautiously took a pastry. It was golden and still warm. Do you want some tea? I brewed it from herbs. Like a magician, Judy pulled out more and more supplies from her large wheeled bag. There was already a big thermos on the table. What's your name? Judy asked. Wendy. Good name. And suits you? Judy nodded. Wendy and Judy sat across from each other. Take more. Under your eyes, there are dark circles. Are you a student? The woman looked attentively at Wendy's face. Wendy shook her head and turned to the window. Why tell a stranger about herself? Who would be interested? Judy didn't look away. She could see something had happened to the girl. Her eyes were sad. Where are you going? Home, or to school, or maybe to your husband? Wendy shrugged. She felt awkward. Understanding, she looked impolite. Judy seemed to sense that the girl wasn't talkative. Smiling, she backed off. Later, Judy made Wendy eat a sandwich and poured a large mug of tea. Wendy felt embarrassed but ate. The neighbor fed her as if they were relatives. By evening, the carriage quieted down and passengers dozed off. Wendy, frozen, sat by the window, gazing at the lights flickering beyond the glass. The rhythmic sound of the wheels lulled her, and she dreamed that the train would never stop, and it would keep going until it brought her to a place where she would feel good and at peace. She sighed heavily. What happened, Wendy? She suddenly heard a quiet, gentle voice. Judy was also looking out the window, as if she wasn't addressing Wendy. Tell me, maybe I can advise something. I see you are suffering. Why keep it to yourself? Two heads are better than one. And she looked at her with such sincere kindness that, without noticing it, Wendy began her story. She wanted to talk, to feel that there was a living person nearby. Even if Judy couldn't help her, at least she would listen and sympathize. The train rushed through the rain and bad weather, and in the dimly lit carriage, two women, young and old, tried to figure out what to do now. Well, here's what Judy finally said after listening to Wendy. You don't need to be alone in a big city. Someone might take advantage of you. Besides, your money will run out quickly. Look, I work in a country house for a family. As a housekeeper. She smiled. They need help right now. Sort of like a caregiver for their old house owner. Don't be scared. The people are good. They won't harm you. Accommodation and meals are on them. The walk is no more complicated than at your hospital. Besides, they have medical staff and doctors coming home. You'll live, save up, and then we'll see. Agree? Oh, Judy, I don't refuse. Where else will you find such an opportunity but my resume? Wendy hesitated. That's nothing. These are trustworthy people. I'll put in a good word for you. Just don't let me down. I've been with them for many years. I remember when the young master of the house was still a little boy. Thank you, Judy. Thank you so much. I won't let you down. I can do everything clean, tidy up, and even handle the most unruly. Okay, Judy chuckled. I believe you. Wendy smiled and, unable to hold back, burst into tears. She felt so grateful that lately she had encountered kind people. As if the world had finally decided to prove that not only bad things happen in life. One must love, believe, help, and kindness will come back to you. The main thing is not to betray yourself. Now Wendy eagerly awaited the train to reach its destination. She spent the rest of the journey in conversation, telling about herself, and even showing the darkened ring that was her only remaining memory of her mother. Judy listened and occasionally turned to the window to discreetly wipe away the tears that welled up in her eyes. Poor girl, so young, and already so much injustice has befallen her, she thought. Shaking her head, she held the ring in her hands, surprised as she looked at the inscription inside. She had never touched antique items before, let alone those with such a tragic history. Judy herself had a difficult fate. Her husband had died long ago, and her son died of meningitis when he was just 1.5 years old. From grief, the woman was ready to lie down in the grave with him. Then she recovered a bit and began to hope that another child would be born. But God did not give her that, and she remained alone. Later, she joined the family of Professor Flynn. Their homes were adjacent. She helped with the household chores even before the birth of their son, Neil. Now Neil is an adult and lives separately, only visiting his parents. Meeting Wendy, Judy felt her heart tremble with surprise. She was filled with compassion and love for this frightened girl with gray eyes. She reached out to her with her whole soul, wanting to help and protect her. What was this? Who knows? Perhaps it was an unspent maternal love. The train arrived at the station early. Judy was greeted by a slender, taciturn man with lush black mustaches. Wendy even slightly opened her mouth in surprise. She had only seen such mustaches in cartoons, as if they weren't real. Here, Heaton, meet Wendy. If Patricia and George allow, she'll be my assistant, Judy introduced. Heaton nodded, picked up their bags, and quickly headed down the platform. Judy and Wendy followed him. Don't mind his grumpy appearance. He's the kindest person. The driver for the academic, Judy said. Are his mustaches real? Wendy asked. Judy even stopped. She looked at the girl and suddenly burst into loud laughter. Heaton turned his head to see why Judy was laughing, and, twitching his mustaches like a cat, continued walking. Oh, you've amused me. Of course, they're real. You should see how he combs them every morning. It's his main pride, Judy said. Wendy blushed and, scolding herself for being impolite, hurried to join everyone at their exit. Watching Heaton slightly hunched back, she thought that he must surely have a big car. How else would he fit his long, thin legs? In the parking lot, an entirely ordinary car awaited them. Small and not too large, white in color. Heaton got inside. It was evident that he had long been accustomed to the inconveniences caused by his height. Judy sat in the front seat, and Wendy found herself in the back. It was both frightening and interesting. Where was she going to arrive now? She really wanted to make a good impression on their academic and his wife, and stay in their house. She had no idea where to go if they didn't accept her. Calming herself by remembering her good luck so far, Wendy tried to focus on the landscapes outside the window. Passing broad avenues and streets that were already filling with cars, Heaton turned onto a country road. Private houses stretched along the road. They looked diverse and heterogeneous. Some were old wooden houses, very similar to 19th century homes. Next to them stood 2- and 3-story stone mansions, while modern cottages designed for single families hid in between. A piece of the forest was visible in the distance, not completely shedding its yellowed attire. The car turned towards the forest. The asphalt road turned into a dirt one, but the surrounding area was well kept and pleasant. Trees were everywhere. How beautiful it is here in spring and summer, Wendy thought, gazing at the trees. Look, there are berries over there, Judy said, as if reading her thoughts. Sometimes I work there with Lumpy. That's a dog. We got her to guard the house, but it turns out we have to guard it ourselves. She's a kind soul. Wendy smiled, imagining the friendly dog. The news about the dog cheered her up. Good people don't mistreat their pets. Soon, a green low fence appeared, behind which a pointed roof peeked out. Wendy's heart suddenly raced, and she felt her mouth go dry from excitement. Judy was also a bit nervous. This unexpected visit with a stranger felt strange, but she bit her lip. It couldn't be that they wouldn't like Wendy. The automatic gates opened, and the car slowly entered. Wendy looked at Judy with fear. "Well, what are you waiting for? Let's go." Judy sighed and opened the door. Wendy instantly fell in love with the house she saw. It was a modern 2-story cottage stylized to look like an old house. Arches, pointed roofs, a small attic, all of it made it resemble English stone houses that still exist in green valleys. Wendy discovered there was a fireplace in the house. The grey walls were covered with branches of wild grapevine. Its leaves had long turned red and now quivered in the autumn wind. The area around the house was well kept, as if a gardener had worked on it. There was no visible garden, but perhaps it was behind the house. Emerald lawns with late autumn flowers delighted the eyes. A bit further away, utility buildings were visible, and beyond them, the forest began. Dark spruces grew on the northern side, protecting the house from the cold wind. The air was filled with the scent of decaying leaves, grass, and something special. Suddenly, from somewhere Wendy couldn't figure out, a large dog with light golden fur jumped out. It barked loudly and happily, running around and looking at Wendy with kind brown eyes. It seemed to her that the dog was smiling. Its face looked so friendly. "Hello, Lumpy." "Hello," Judy said affectionately. "Meet Wendy." The dog turned its head to the side and stared at the girl as if deciding whether to approach her or not. Within a minute, Lumpy was already circling around Wendy's legs, eager to lick her hand. Wendy laughed and petted the dog's silky fur. "He's truly adorable," she remarked. Heaton carried their belongings into the house, and Judy followed suit. Wendy had no choice but to go along with them. Suddenly, she felt a shyness engulf her. How would she be received in this large and beautiful house? A spacious living room with panoramic windows welcomed them in silence. Wendy looked around. One of the walls was adorned with decorative stone, and there was indeed a real fireplace. Inside, logs were stacked, but the fire was not lit. On a low shelf nearby, large ceramic vases with dried flowers stood. In the center of the room, there was a large soft rug and comfortable modern furniture. A bookshelf with books and magazines, a floor lamp, patterned throw pillows, it all contributed to the beauty and coziness. It was immediately evident that this house was loved and cherished. Some parts were adorned with wood, complementing the dark staircase leading to the second floor. Unusual patterned lamps hung from the ceiling, and several paintings adorned the walls, one of them depicting a cottage in the summertime. The house looked even more beautiful in the summer. Wendy sighed. "It would be nice to stay here." Judy gestured to a chair for Wendy, and then smoothed her hair, glanced at herself in the large mirror, and went upstairs. Heaton disappeared through the doors leading to the kitchen. Wendy remained seated in the living room. Time passed slowly. Later, the large red wooden floor clock struck 10 times. Wendy concentrated on the minute hand. Finally, it leaped ahead by a full 10 minutes. Only then did an indistinct sound echo from the stairs, and 2 pairs of legs appeared. Apparently, the homeowner was descending with Judy. Wendy stood up and froze. She was nervous, fearing that her hesitation might disrupt the conversation and make her seem uncultured. "Hello, dear Wendy, right? I'm Patricia. Very nice to meet you. Judy told me about you." "Oh, please, have a seat." Wendy smiled. Before her was a very dignified elderly lady of short stature with gray, neatly trimmed hair. Her intelligent, lively eyes looked penetratingly, as if peering into the soul. Wendy felt a bit shy but sat in the armchair, folding her hands on her lap. The hostess settled opposite her. There was a low table between them, and a few minutes later, Judy brought a tray with cups and a teapot, sitting nearby. Patricia poured the tea herself, offered some cookies, and skillfully led the conversation in a way that Wendy suddenly found herself sharing everything about herself without holding back. "Whatever will be," she decided, realizing that there was nothing to hide here. The old lady nodded and smiled, appreciating the girl's openness. "Well, Wendy, I can see you're a good and decent person, and Judy vouches for you. If our terms suit you, then welcome to our warm company. We don't have noisy entertainments, but you won't find our company dull either. Patricia took another sip of tea and suddenly leaned towards Wendy, patting her warmly on the hand. Stay. I think you'll like it here. Judy will tell you about your duties. They're not many. I don't consider anyone here servants, and I'm not finicky. There are, of course, some rules, but they're not complicated. As for payment, here it is. The lady handed Wendy a contract. We draft the contract to put your mind at ease. No fines, compensations, or losses are specified there. It's all unnecessary. I always trust those I welcome into my home. So, she didn't finish her sentence and shrugged, as if apologizing for not having more to offer. Wendy began reading the contract and, upon seeing the amount she was entitled to as payment for the month, widened her eyes. Then, she looked at Patricia and Judy skeptically, as if she couldn't believe that such a thing could happen at all. It was 5 times more than what she earned at the hospital. It even felt awkward to her. What could they possibly pay her such money for? And to live in such a house on top of that. Well, are you agreeable? If yes, Judy will show you to your room, and I'll introduce you to George a little later. He's busy with procedures now. Wendy nodded and hurriedly started filling in the empty fields in the contract. It felt like she would wake up any moment in her humble apartment and realize that the beautiful house with a cozy and beautiful living room was just a mirage. That's excellent. I'm very pleased. Patricia smiled and stood up. Wendy hurried to get up too. A blush appeared on her cheeks from excitement, making her look even prettier. She tucked a strand of hair behind her ear and tossed the slightly disheveled braid over her shoulder. I used to have a braid like that in my youth, the elderly lady said, and now here I am. She laughed with a bright laughter and tousled her short haircut. It looked so natural and lively that Wendy admired it. How wonderful it is when a person, even at such an elegant age, still loves life. She understood that she would settle into this house. It accepted her, and she felt good here. Judy cleared the dishes and led her ward upstairs to show her room. They climbed the stairs to the 2nd floor, passed by several closed wooden doors, then turned the corner and climbed another narrow staircase to their attic. The room turned out to be small but very cozy. Despite the minimal furniture, everything necessary was there: a bed with soft pillows, a wooden shelf, a narrow wardrobe, and a chest in the corner, covered with a quilt. A small window was adorned with curtains. Wendy kicked off her shoes and walked across the creaking wooden floor, stepping carefully onto a vibrant rug made of colorful patches. The room was pleasantly warm, and Wendy was delighted that she wouldn't have to layer multiple sweaters anymore to fend off drafts. How do you like it? Judy asked, glancing at the young woman. It's wonderful, Wendy exclaimed sincerely, carefully sitting on the bed. Judy smiled. You can find bedding in the trunk. Come on, let me show you around, including the bathroom, and explain your responsibilities in the house. And so, Wendy stayed in the Flynn house. She didn't predict what would happen next. Time will tell. In the evening, she laid out the freshly scented sheets, put on a clean shirt, and slipped under the covers. A small night light glowed overhead. Outside, an unusual silence prevailed, and the house filled with the rhythmic breath of sleep. Wendy felt her eyes getting heavy, and within a minute, she was sound asleep. Her new life unfolded with calm and peaceful days. In the morning, Wendy first visited George, helping him freshen up. Then, she fed him breakfast and, wrapping him up warmly, took him out to the veranda. The forest wind blew through the open windows as George squinted, enjoying the autumn sun on his face. Lumpy rushed over, happily jumping around, inviting Wendy to play on the lawn. She got annoyed and chased him away. Go on, Wendy. Take a break. I'm not tired yet, George, she replied. Without reminders, she handed the professor a book, and for an hour and a half, he immersed himself in collections of scientific articles and anthologies. Wendy strictly followed the routine and resisted any persuasion to skip procedures or exercises, returning the grumbling old man to his room by the appointed time, where Charlie and Eden awaited him. They came specifically every day. "Wendy, what if I give you a bribe?" George joked, gesturing towards the nightstand where a box of chocolates lay. "I don't take bribes," Wendy slyly smiled. "And I won't succumb to sweets." The professor shrugged. "What are you going to do with her?" And he admired her gray eyes, soft smile, and shiny thick braid. Sometimes Patricia joined her husband on the veranda. Then he would smile broadly and gently kiss her hand. They were a wonderful couple, and Wendy, watching them, always smiled. There was so much tenderness and devoted love in the eyes and gestures of their old couple as they sincerely and touchingly cared for each other. For some reason, in those moments, her parents came to mind again. She was sure they would have lived to a ripe old age. Dad would still hug Mom by the shoulders, and she would press against him while adjusting his scarf. Wendy easily settled into the house and performed her duties quickly and neatly. Judy was pleased with her. Patricia affectionately called her dear, and George rejoiced like a child when a quiet knock on his door was heard in the morning. Wendy was always friendly, and no one ever saw her discontented. Even the grumpy Heaton started to smile when she was around, and Lumpy never left her side. Wendy was very grateful to fate for meeting Judy just in time, and now she lives in paradise-like conditions. When she had a free moment, Wendy would go to the kitchen and help Judy or just sit and listen to her stories. "Judy, do Patricia and George have children?" "We had a son." Judy lowered her voice. "He died in a car accident with his wife. It was a long time ago. Neil was still a child, never quite recovered. There's nothing worse than losing your own child." The woman sniffled, recalling her grief. Wendy felt sorry for the elderly couple, wondering why fate could be so cruel to good people. "And Neil, does he visit?" "Yes, he does visit, but he's often away on business trips. We all take care of their old folks." Judy smiled. "You'll meet him someday. He's not bad, just has a complex character. Sometimes he clashes with George in an argument. They don't give in. Patricia runs between them, calming them down, but then they make up. If it weren't for Neil, do you think they could afford doctors and care? It's all expensive, and you know it yourself." Once a week, on Saturdays, Heaton loaded them into the car and took them to some kind of board meeting. Wendy stayed with George, making sure he took his medication on time, feeding him, and if he felt unwell due to the weather or pressure, she sat nearby in a chair to help when needed. Sometimes it was just a matter of holding his hand, sometimes opening a window to let in the cold autumn air, refreshing the room with dampness and prompting him to snuggle deeper into a warm blanket. Then the old man's cheeks would flush, and he would gratefully glance at his helper. Soon he would feel better. Wendy closed the book and glanced at the clock. It was time to give the medications. Her attic window faced the forest, so she couldn't see or hear who was approaching or entering the yard. All her hope was on Lumpy, but the friendly dog just wagged his tail and looked at strangers with joyous shiny eyes. The staircase almost didn't creak under her light steps. Wendy gently knocked on the door and, opening it, shuddered. Next to George's bed, leaning over the old man, stood a stranger. With one hand, he sorted through the medicines on the nightstands, and with the other, he reached somewhere around the head or neck of the sleeping man. "Step away from him," Wendy said loudly, her voice trembling with fear. But she had no intention of leaving the helpless elderly man alone with this unknown intruder. The man by the bed froze. Without taking her eyes off him, Wendy felt for the base of the table lamp, gripped it, and then cracked the door open and shouted towards the stairs. "Heaton, Judy, call the police quickly." She knew there was no one else in the house but her and George. And now, this intruder. But she wanted to scare him off and show that there were more people nearby. "Wendy." Suddenly came George's weak voice. What are you doing? Listen, could you not scream? Besides, I know there's no one else in the house, the suspicious stranger asked, a bit irritated, and turned around. Wendy was faced with a pleasant-looking man in his 30s. Dark hair fell in waves on his forehead. Brown eyes with an unusual hazel shade looked slightly mocking. Wendy realized he was staring at her hand, clutching the lamp's base. I hope you're not planning to shoot me with that, he asked, and suddenly, she guessed who was in front of her. The girl's face flushed. She quickly withdrew her hand from the tool she intended to defend herself with and licked her lips, dried from excitement. Nail, you scared Wendy. George's voice came. Wendy. So, that's the name of your faithful guardian. You know, Grandpa, she's better than Lumpy. Wendy rolled her eyes, thinking, what a cheeky guy. She felt offended being compared to a dog, being called a guardian. What a snob. Thinks he can do anything just because he's the grandson. Of course, he can. A thought flashed as if in confirmation. After all, he is the owner and pays your salary. Well, don't be sarcastic. Neil, Grandpa's voice became firmer. Wendy is a wonderful girl, and she helps me a lot. And you came unexpectedly. I got scared when I saw you, too. I even thought some bandit decided to help himself. Oh, come on, Grandpa. Don't get worked up. George groaned and sat up in bed. Wendy immediately stepped towards him, pushing his grandson aside. Step away, please. George needs to take his medicine, she said angrily, and started unscrewing the lid. Her fingers trembled slightly. She was still agitated, her heart pounding. Please. Neil raised his hands, stepped aside, and again smiled ironically. Wendy managed to notice a mole on his right cheek and thick eyelashes. He might have had a slightly oversized nose, but even that didn't greatly diminish his quite attractive appearance. His eyebrows were as thick and straight as his grandfather's. Feeling Neil's gaze on her, Wendy placed the tablets in George's palm, held his head, and gave him water to swallow them. Her cheeks were still red, and Wendy was angry at herself for making a fool of herself. Pondering this, she adjusted the pillow and tucked in the blanket. There, everything's in order now. Shall I go, George? Yes, Wendy. Thank you. Go ahead, and we'll discuss something with Neil here. Wendy nodded and tried to step towards the door when suddenly Neil gently touched her hand. Thank you. Sorry for scaring you. Wendy looked him straight in the eyes, color of dark honey, and saw sparks of laughter in her. She was completely bewildered and, muttering something incoherent, rushed out the door. Neil's warm fingers left a burning sensation on Wendy's wrist. The old man's voice echoed from the room, followed by Neil's soft laughter. Angrily frowning, Wendy hurried downstairs. Why hadn't anyone warned her that the grandson would arrive today? She wouldn't have ended up in such a ridiculous situation. But most likely, his visit would be a surprise for everyone else as well. And so it turned out. Patricia and Judy, who had returned, were delighted to see Neil. With laughter, he recounted how today a fragile girl almost hit him on the head with a heavy lamp. Listening to him, Wendy couldn't help but smile. The resentment and fear had long subsided, and she looked at Neil, noticing more and more resemblance to his grandfather. It was decided to set the dinner table in the living room. George also descended to the table, using a special lift attached to the stairs. Patricia fussed around her husband, and he kept reassuring her not to worry. The living room was filled with an unusual noise and commotion. Even Lumpy couldn't find a place for himself and kept approaching Neil, sniffing his hands, then lying down by the fireplace and squinting at the fire. Judy asked Wendy to pass her the decanter with punch. The ruby liquid sparkled brightly under the lamp, and little apples floated inside. To pick up the decanter, Neil stood up from his chair. "Let me help," he said, looking directly into Wendy's eyes. Perhaps he treated all the girls like that. He was accustomed to their anticipation of his attention. Wendy didn't look away. letting him not think she fell under his charm. Yes, he was handsome, and he clearly knew it, but he was too carefree and self-satisfied, and she never liked such types. She handed him the punch and calmly turned to Patricia. Neil raised an eyebrow in surprise, but didn't say anything. "What? Didn't Neil appeal to you?" Judy asked with a smile the next day. Wendy blushed and glared at her angrily. "He just startled me. I didn't expect to meet him. He likes surprises." Judy nodded. "But don't worry, he'll get more serious when he gets married." Married? Wendy wondered to herself. What did you think? He's sitting here waiting for you. She asked herself. I don't care about this self-centered guy at all. Wendy answered herself. Judy looked closely at the girl and continued. Today, Nicole is coming. His fiancée. They want to celebrate the wedding in the summer, but they're currently arguing with Grandpa about it. Nicole dreams of having the ceremony on the islands, but George insists on getting married here so that he can attend. Nicole wants a lavish wedding, and George says it's better to celebrate everything with the family. Nicole thinks, and what does Neil want? Judy suddenly interrupted Wendy. She frowned. Wendy's question caught her off guard. Well, probably the same thing. She replied hesitantly. You're always talking about Nicole dreaming, Nicole wanting, and there's no mention of Neil. It's as if he's not even involved, Wendy said with some unclear irritation. She herself didn't understand why she suddenly got so angry. What did it matter to her what Neil and his Nicole wanted? While Judy was trying to figure out what to say in response, Wendy called Patricia, and she gladly escaped from the kitchen. She wasn't afraid to meet Neil. Early in the morning, he had gone to the city, promising to return closer to the evening. Wendy really hoped she wouldn't be invited to the ceremonial dinner today. It felt uncomfortable to sit at the table with the same people you work for. It seemed somehow wrong. After lunch, when George dozed off and Patricia, reading a book, remained to watch over his sleep, Wendy decided to take a walk in the forest. She wanted to be alone, to think about her own things. She called Lumpy, let him out on the other side of the house, and walked along the wide path. She glanced at the sky several times. A light rain was falling, but her bright yellow raincoat prevented her from getting wet. Lumpy ran ahead, sometimes returning to Wendy, trying to put his dirty paws on her, and wagging his tail cheerfully. Wendy enjoyed breathing in the moist air. Among the tall, dark firs, she carefully stepped on crunchy cones, pushed aside rare branches of shrubs, and listened to the creaking trunks swaying in the wind. Suddenly, she found herself in a shady twilight. It was much darker in the forest than on their approach to it. Wendy stopped in fear and looked back. Lumpy didn't run far ahead anymore. He timidly worked beside her. A squirrel suddenly darted out. Wendy flinched and laughed. The squirrel flashed its gray-red tail and raced away. A crow cawed several times, and its cry reminded her of the hospital and the autumn days when she saved Mr. Corduroy. Why did he come to her mind now? What happened to him? Maybe she should call Mrs. Y at the hospital and ask if their old man recovered. How could she know that Mr. Corduroy had long ago found out her address and immediately went to her after being discharged? He listened to her neighbor in bewilderment. She left. She didn't tell anyone anything, just packed up and left somewhere. Maybe she found some man. The neighbor told him. Mr. Corduroy went outside, shaking his head. Because of him, what was he going to do now? But Wendy didn't know any of this. Lost in her thoughts, she continued walking farther and farther. Then she stopped. She needed to go back. Suddenly, on the side of the path, she noticed some movement and strange rustling sounds. In a moment, a gray hedgehog appeared among the fallen leaves. Wendy smiled, almost like in a fairy tale. She wanted to take a closer look at it, so she bravely stepped on the bumps. She wasn't afraid to get her feet wet. The rubber boots she borrowed from Judy protected her reliably. How and when her foot sank into a fairly deep pit, Wendy didn't understand. It happened in seconds. Bam! And Wendy was already lying on her side, a sharp pain piercing her ankle. She screamed. The hedgehog quickly disappeared into the bushes, and the crows cawed louder, scattering in different directions. Wet leaves stuck to her jeans, and her hands were covered in mud. Lumpy jumped around. He whined and tugged at Wendy's raincoat, urging her to get up. She tried to stand, but it hurt a lot, and stepping on her right foot was impossible. Most likely, a sprain or a strain. What to do now? She had gone far from home and hadn't told anyone. She crawled to a wet moss-covered tree and leaned against it. There was a fleeting hope that the pain would subside gradually. Then she could, limping but slowly, make her way back. But the leg continued to hurt, and standing up was impossible. Well, I can't crawl through the forest. Wendy chuckled in desperation. Lumpy whined again and touched her cheek with his cold nose. Another half hour passed. It was getting completely dark, and Wendy began to freeze. The rain intensified. Why didn't I just sit in a warm room? Wendy scolded herself. Something cracked deep in the forest. Wendy stretched her neck, peering into the thicket. Somewhere far away, a train hummed, and the wind rustled the branches again. Lumpy, Lumpy, home. Go home. Wendy suddenly ordered the dog. The idea that the dog could help her grew stronger. She just had to hope he wasn't foolish and could bring Heaton or Judy here. She just needed to get to the path. From there, she could slowly hop and reach home. Wendy petted Lumpy and repeated, "Run home, home." Finally, the dog understood what was expected of him and hesitantly ran onto the path. He sprinted ahead but returned after a few seconds, lifting his paws and giving Wendy a questioning look again. She repeated the command loudly. Lumpy seemed to bounce in place and, a blur of fur, disappeared behind the trees. Wendy remained waiting. Raindrops ran down her face, and it was getting colder. The wet, cold ground seemed to drain the last warmth from her body. Wendy tucked her reddened palms into her pockets and curled into a ball. She could feel her foot swelling inside the boot. Time crawled slowly. It became completely dark, and Wendy feared that Lumpy might have lost his way. Now no one would find them. She started to cry. Branches rustled in the distance, and suddenly, shouts were heard, accompanied by the beam of a flashlight. Lumpy's loud barking echoed, and Judy's voice rang out, "Wendy, Wendy, where are you?" Wendy tried to shout back, but her throat tightened into a spasm, and she coughed. She could hear the crunch of pine cones and twigs under the boots of those who came to help her, and suddenly Neil's face leaned over her. He anxiously looked into her eyes. "What? Your foot? Which one?" Wendy sobbed and laughed simultaneously. Judy, attempting to wrap her in the blanket she brought, and Lumpy, barking loudly and bustling between them, causing chaos. Neil restored order. He straightened up and said loudly, "Judy, step back and take the dog. Wendy, can you lean on me and slowly stand up? I'll help you." Wendy nodded uncertainly, biting her lip in pain and awkwardly clinging to the man as she got up. She couldn't put any weight on her foot. Neil, holding her around the waist, helped her onto the path. Wendy breathed heavily but tried not to groan. She felt embarrassed for causing such a commotion in the house. Neil instructed Judy to go ahead and not interfere. "Judy, go home. Prepare dry clothes, painkillers, and an elastic bandage. Let's see if we can manage without doctors. It seems like just a sprain." Judy obediently complied, and then the unthinkable happened. Neil lifted Wendy in his arms and carried her towards the house. She tried to say something in protest, but he just held her tighter. He didn't stop once during their entire way, ignoring the mud on his white sneakers and the wet hair sticking to his forehead. Patricia greeted them on the porch, pacing around, throwing her hands up, exclaiming, "Darling Wendy, how could this happen? Why didn't you say you were going to the forest? And what if not Lumpy?" Oh. Neil carried Wendy into the living room and settled her into a chair. Someone removed her raincoat. Shoulders were covered with a warm blanket, and Judy was already handing her a cup of hot tea with lemon. Wendy shivered and chattered her teeth. Whether from the cold or the ordeal, it was hard to tell. Neil knelt down and delicately attempted to remove Wendy's boot, causing her to yelp. Scissors were brought to cut the not-so-high boot. Neil carefully pulled down her sock and examined her foot. The ankle was swollen, but overall, it didn't seem too alarming. Judy quickly applied a cooling gel to the skin, gave Wendy a pill, and then tightly bandaged her shin. Wendy looked at everyone with gratitude and a hint of guilt. She had caused quite a commotion. Footsteps echoed on the stairs. With the corner of her eye, Wendy noticed a slender figure descending. Within seconds, the stranger froze almost directly across from her. One hand remained on the railing, and in the other, she held a phone. "Neil, you left me alone to save the servants." Judy said something confused and quickly retreated to the kitchen, pretending that she had something burning on the stove. Patricia had left earlier to calm down George. In the living room, there were only Wendy, Neil, and Lumpy, who everyone regarded as the hero of the day, and he didn't mind. Perhaps he'd get a tasty treat out of it. Blushing, Wendy looked at Neil with embarrassment and turned away. She couldn't even stand up to escape this embarrassment. The stranger's words echoed in her head. "Nicole." Neil's voice sounded sharp. "Please watch what you say." Nicole slowly moved forward, coming closer. Tucking her phone into her jeans pocket, she adjusted a strand of hair that had fallen onto her face. Her black eyes were brightly lined, and her high cheekbones hinted at thoughts of a plastic surgeon, as did her lips, full, precisely outlined with crimson lipstick. Nicole smiled, revealing gleaming, perfectly white teeth. Her slender thighs hugged light gray jeans, and a black blouse exposed tan skin and a perfectly flat stomach. A snake-shaped charm dangled on a chain over her high chest. Her eyes sparkled predatorily in the lamplight. Wendy felt uncomfortable. There was a sense of danger emanating from this young, confident woman, much like from a real reptile. Crossing her arms over her chest, Nicole stood directly in front of Wendy and began to scrutinize her coldly, as if she had seen some kind of exhibit. Her face froze in a mixture of contempt and arrogance. Wendy immediately realized that she wouldn't find common ground with this girl. Fortunately, Judy and Patricia returned to the living room. When Nicole saw the homeowner, her facial expression instantly changed. Now it was a doll-like face of a naive girl with wide-open eyes. Wendy was amazed at such a rapid transformation. Smiling pleasantly, Nicole approached Patricia and kindly took the plate of cookies from her hands. "Wendy," the old lady looked concerned, "you won't be able to climb up to the attic, so for now, you'll stay in the guest room on the first floor. Everything you need will be close by. And, of course, you need rest until you recover. No heroic deeds around the house." She wagged her finger. Nicole snorted, and approaching Neil closely, she embraced him around the waist. Hugging tightly, she reached up and kissed him on the cheek. It was evident that she had no qualms about displaying her affection in public, and everyone was accustomed to it. Neil politely freed himself and moved toward the fireplace. There, he sat in an armchair and, losing interest in everything around, leaned down to clear the embers and add more wood. Nicole promptly perched on the armrest closer to Neil. Her slender fingers glided over his neck, playing with the damp hair. Wendy turned away. She was so tired and on edge. She needed to lie down and sleep to end this dreadful long evening finally. With Judy's assistance, she made her way to the guest room, where everything seemed unfamiliar and indifferent. Her room in the attic was much more charming and cozy. There was a massive floor-to-ceiling window covered with thick brown curtains, a large double bed where one could get lost, and a private bathroom with a door adorned with a gilded handle. Wendy almost cried, knowing that her tears had nothing to do with the pain in her leg. Something inside her hurt as if she had been unjustly offended. When Judy left, she finally burst into tears. Somewhere far beyond the window, trees rustled, and the pale moon tried to break through the curtain of clouds to peek at what these strange people were doing on the ground. However, the dense curtains reliably concealed the tear-stained face of the girl. Wendy slept soundly, her swollen lips twitching in resentment. It seemed that even in her dreams, she was reliving Nicole's haughty gaze and the disdain emanating from her. For some reason, Mr. Corduroy appeared in her dream that night. He had turned gray, and in the dream, his hair had grown long, enveloping him from head to toe. He stood on a tuft in the middle of a deep swamp, silently watching Wendy. She ran along the dark water, unable to figure out how to help him. The old man said nothing, only looked at her with sad eyes, and suddenly he straightened up and raised his head. Two swans circled in the sky above him. "Be careful," Mr. Corduroy whispered softly, and the birds lifted him and carried him upward. Wendy remained below, alone. She woke up with a pounding heart and didn't immediately understand where she was. The gray morning pierced through the loosely closed curtain. Wendy's first impulse was to jump out of bed, wash up, and run to George. However, a sudden movement immediately elicited pain in her leg. Remembering yesterday's incident, Neil's warm breath, his hands firmly holding her body, Wendy removed the bandage, applied gel to her skin, and cautiously tried to move her foot. The swelling had reduced slightly, but the leg was still unwieldy. Leaning carefully on her toes, Wendy made her way to the bathroom, tidied herself up, and looked in the mirror. No deceit or mystery. She sighed. Nothing like Nicole. There was a knock on the door, and Judy came in with breakfast. Wendy felt a bit embarrassed. Why? She thought. She could have easily hopped to the kitchen. "What do you mean?" Judy kindly replied. "I'm taking care of you." Throughout the day, Wendy read a book, petted Lumpy, and then unknowingly dozed off. Judy peeked in, asked about dinner, but Wendy insisted on staying in her room. Nothing needed to be brought to her. Holding onto the wall and hopping on one leg, she focused so much on this process that she didn't notice Neil emerging from the kitchen. Wendy collided with him right at the doorway, crashing into his chest. "Whoa," he exclaimed, surprised. "I guess you're feeling better." Wendy shyly averted her eyes from his penetrating gaze. The man was looking at her. "Yes, thank you, not a problem." Neil smiled. He didn't leave, but continued to scrutinize her. Wendy felt uneasy about her bare feet and her overall homely appearance. "I might as well have come out in pajamas," she scolded herself. "And thank you for rescuing me yesterday. I hope it wasn't too hard for you." "Not at all." At that moment, Neil stared at her dangling foot. "Look at that. She has such tiny feet. Are they even a thing? And the nails aren't painted. Pink, like a child's." He was used to Nicole wearing size 41 shoes, and her toenails were always bright and shiny. Once he asked for a more subtle color, but Nicole just snorted. "Neil, let me decide what color to paint and how." He also liked her fingers, straight and neat, like in a picture. Nicole's second toe was longer than the first, and the feet themselves were broad. No amount of care could hide their lack of beauty and roughness. However, Nicole was completely unconcerned about it. She never doubted her beauty and irresistibility. Frozen, Wendy stood by the door, waiting for Neil to leave, but he seemed in no hurry. At that moment, Nicole emerged from the living room. Wendy locked eyes with her, feeling uncomfortable, as she saw so much undisguised malice on the beautiful face. "Did I interrupt?" Nicole asked, approaching Neil and wrapping herself around him. Neil hugged her waist and silently led her into the living room. Wendy breathed a sigh of relief, jumped into the kitchen, and firmly closed the door behind her. "I wish they would leave sooner," she thought, looking thoughtfully out of the window. Several days passed. Her leg was gradually recovering. Wendy could now slowly move around the house, for which she received scolding from both Judy and Patricia. And even George grumbled. "Where are you hopping around? As if I can't manage without you." Wendy smiled. She could see that their old man actually missed her, and she enjoyed returning to her usual activities. It helped her think less about Neil. She got mad at herself, tried to distract herself, all the while listening, wondering if a large car, resembling a black shark, would pull up to the gates, if a cheerful voice would echo in the living room, and if the slightly sharp scent of citrus and bergamot would waft through the house. But no one else came. From the conversations, Wendy understood that Neil had gone on another business trip. In the evenings, while reading a book, Wendy would pause, reminiscing about the first time she saw that guy. How he looked at her when she went to the kitchen. "Stop it," she scolded herself. "You've seen Nicole, and they're getting married soon. What silly fantasies. Even if he were single, remember who he is and who you are." 3 weeks passed. One day, Wendy woke up and was surprised. The small window in her attic was glowing with unusual light. The first snow had fallen. Lumpy raced around the yard with loud barks, burying his paws in the snow, digging a hole, snorting with joy, or so it seemed. Wrapped in a warm shawl, Wendy stood on the porch, smiling as she watched the dog. She shifted her gaze a bit further and noticed the green, sprawling fir trees in the snow. Her thoughts once again drifted to Neil. I wonder if he likes winter. Perhaps during Christmas vacation, he goes skiing with Nicole in the mountains, or, on the contrary, travels to tropical islands to sunbathe. And suddenly, as if by magic, the gates opened, revealing a dark, large car. Wendy's heart skipped a beat, but her joy proved to be in vain. Nicole leaped onto the cleared road. She was wearing a short red jacket that beautifully complemented her black hair. Piercing the snow with thin heels, she walked to the porch, opened the door, and, seeing Wendy, slid past her with an indifferent glance. "Hello," Wendy greeted, but Nicole, without a word, and without even turning her head, walked on. Wendy looked after her in confusion. Soon, Heaton brought several gift bags into the house. "Neil asked me to stop by and bring you Christmas gifts," Nicole said, holding Patricia's hands. She tried to free herself from her firm grip, but it wasn't easy. Nicole seemed oblivious to the fact that their old lady didn't like it. "It's a shame we're giving them in advance, but he thought he could drop by between business trips. It didn't work out. The board of directors decided otherwise, and Neil flew off. He'll only be back after the holidays. It's terrible." Nicole pouted her plump lips. "I miss him so much." Judy began to unpack the bags and boxes. Each of them had a tag indicating who the gift was for. She frowned in puzzlement and glanced at the guest, as if wanting to ask something but hesitating. "Neil has already sent gift certificates to the doctors and massage therapists," Nicole said. "As for you, recluses, we chose something together." She laughed. Patricia also smiled and invited everyone to have tea. Wendy declined, citing a headache. She didn't want to sit under the gaze of this viper. "You're just jealous," a voice whispered inside. "No way," Wendy protested, but her mood soured. Passing by the table with the gifts, she noticed that there was nothing for her. There were gifts for Heaton, for Judy, but an empty space for her. "That serves me right." I got carried away, biting my lips, Wendy thought. And who said Neil would remember me? She approached the window and drew the curtain. A large car stood in the middle of the yard. Lumpy was gone, probably warming up by the fireplace, listening to the empty chatter and exclamations of that silly doll. If Wendy could peek into the car's trunk, she would see another bag intended for her. Nicole simply didn't see the need to ask Heaton to bring it into the house. She deliberately tossed it as far away as possible and, for good measure, covered it with a blanket. The soft, light blue sweater almost fell onto the rubber mat, and its edge got dirty on a plastic brush. Nicole was furious when she saw Neil choosing a gift for this beggar, whom his grandparents had taken in out of pity for some reason. Patricia briefly recounted Wendy's story. Back then, Nicole had asked if they weren't afraid for the valuables in the house. After all, This unknown girl had been fired almost for theft, but no one listened to her. They looked at her strangely and quickly changed the subject. And this fool went to buy a gift. Generally, gifts could only be given to grandparents. Why bother giving them to the chauffeur and the cook? It's unclear, but Neil considers them family members. Probably this ragged girl with the silly braid too. But it's okay. Once she becomes his lawful wife, she'll change things. And the first thing she'll do is stop giving gifts to the help. No need to waste extra money. Nicole herself didn't work anywhere. She came from the kind of family that could afford not to work in an office from 9 to 6. For fun, she modeled for one of the magazines, and her dad and Neil gave her money. But after marriage, they would live solely on Neil's earnings, so financial control was absolutely necessary. The tea party wasn't long. Nicole was terribly bored with the elderly people, whom she had to politely listen to, nod her head, and pretend it was terribly interesting. She discreetly glanced at her phone. Messages were pouring in endlessly. While Neil was on a business trip, there was an opportunity to have a good time. Go to the club with the girls and have some fun. She needed to hurry. Nicole simply didn't see the need to ask Heaton to bring it into the house. She deliberately tossed it as far away as possible. The soft, light blue fluffy sweater almost fell onto the rubber mat, and its edge got dirty on a plastic brush. Nicole was literally furious when she saw Neil choosing a gift for this beggar, whom his grandparents had taken in out of pity for some reason. Nicole even asked them then if they weren't afraid for the valuables in the house. After all, this unknown girl had been fired almost for theft. But no one listened to her. They looked at her strangely and quickly changed the subject. And this fool went to buy a gift. Generally, gifts could only be given to grandparents. Why bother giving them to the chauffeur and the cook? It's unclear, but Neil considers them family members. Probably this ragged girl with the silly braid too. But that's okay. Once she becomes his lawful wife, she'll change things. And the first thing she'll do is stop giving gifts to the help. No need to waste extra money. Nicole herself didn't work anywhere. She modeled for one of the magazines for fun, and her dad and Neil gave her money. But after marriage, they would live solely on Neil's earnings, so financial control was absolutely necessary. The tea party wasn't long. Nicole was terribly bored with the elderly people. She discreetly glanced at her phone. Messages were pouring in endlessly. While Neil was on a business trip, there was an opportunity to have a good time. Go to the club with the girls and have some fun. She needed to hurry. Nicole, won't you stay? Patricia asked. It's getting dark. Maybe you can leave tomorrow. Don't worry, I'll be fine getting back. Well, see you after the holidays. Merry Christmas to everyone. Neil will definitely video call on Christmas, Nicole said, giving Patricia a peck on the cheek, leaving behind a sweet fragrance of perfume. The old lady shook her head, watching her go. Christmas was approaching. Wendy asked Heaton to take her for some shopping. He brought her to the city, dropped her off near the shopping center, promising to pick her up in 3 hours. Wendy wandered through festive stores, admired the Christmas fair, and like a child, gazed in awe at the huge tree displayed in the hall. Then she found a cozy pastry shop, where she enjoyed a pastry with fresh blueberries and a cup of coffee. Wendy had planned the gifts in advance. For Patricia, an elegant lacquer-painted jewelry box, handmade bookmarks for George. Heaton got a tea set. And for her kind fairy, Judy, a pair of fancy mittens. As she descended to the ground floor, she suddenly noticed an abstract painting in one of the shop windows, made of small colorful squares, like a mosaic. It turned out to be chocolate pieces in bright wrappers. The picture under the glass looked extraordinary, and Wendy knew for sure that Neil would appreciate such a gift. Where did these thoughts come from? She wasn't upset that he hadn't given her anything. She preferred making gifts herself rather than receiving them. Yielding to a sudden impulse, she entered a small shop and bought the sweet picture. She had no intention of giving it to Neil. That would be strange. But let the painting stay with her. She would place it on the windowsill and admire it. Christmas was celebrated modestly, although the large duck stuffed with apples and cranberries caused a storm of delight. Judy sat content and proud. Neil called, congratulated everyone, and promised to come for New Year's. Out of the corner of her eye, Wendy noticed that Nicole was once again hanging on his shoulder, waving insincerely, sending greetings. Neil didn't deceive. After a few days, he entered the house, filling it with his loud voice. Citrus, bergamot, and something else so special that Wendy's heart skipped a beat, and a silly smile appeared on her face. A thought crossed her mind to give him her gift, but she quickly dismissed it. Neil unpacked parcels, boxes, and bags once again. Wendy, this is for you, he said, handing her a voluminous package wrapped in festive paper with bells and fir branches. I think it will go wonderfully with what I gave you for Christmas. Wendy opened her eyes in amazement. Her confusion was so evident that Neil frowned. You received my gift, the sweater, didn't you? I knew it was meant for you the moment I saw it. Without saying a word, Wendy shook her head. Strange. Nicole was supposed to pass it on. I'll ask her. No need. Wendy burst out. You shouldn't have bothered at all. She hugged the package to herself, afraid to look inside. It would be better later when she was alone in her room. Something soft to the touch. Curious. Neil, where's Nicole? Patricia's voice echoed. She went with her parents. She'll be back in 3 days. What about you? The old lady worried. Are you staying with us for long? For a while, Grandma, for a while. Neil laughed and hugged her. I'll catch up on sleep. Feast on Judy's pies. Get my skis and head into the woods. And indeed, the next day, he found skis in the garage, cleaned them, waxed them, and prepared to go. Lumpy happily bounced around, eager for a long walk. Wendy had just stepped outside to fill the bird feeder. Her cheeks blushed. A braid peeked from under a white cap, and a fluffy white scarf, a gift from Neil, was wrapped around her neck. Unintentionally, he admired her. Amazing. No cosmetologists, no painted eyebrows and lips, and she's such a beauty. He thought. Wendy felt his gaze and turned around. She shyly blinked her long lashes, slightly furrowed her brows, and her blush intensified. Wendy, come with me, Neil suddenly said. This time I'll watch over you. He smiled. Wendy didn't know what to say. On the one hand, she was ready to follow him to the ends of the earth, and on the other hand, she was just a helper in the house. What kind of outings could there be? Let's go, Neil persuaded her. I'll let Grandma and Grandpa know. They probably won't object, but you're on skis, and I'm, well, Wendy pointed to her warm high boots. There's another pair in the garage, Neil remembered. They're a bit smaller, just right for you, but I don't know how. Wendy tried to refuse. George will need medicine soon. No worries. I'll show you how to ski. It's easy. And Grandma or Judy can give the pills. 15 minutes later, Neil confidently glided along the beaten path towards the trees, with Wendy cautiously following him. Neil was considerate of his companion, moving at a slow pace and frequently stopping to allow Wendy to catch up. Wendy, unaccustomed to this activity, found herself out of breath, but she was satisfied. Soon, she started to get the hang of it, and Neil approvingly looked on. He hadn't expected that the delicate and non-athletic Wendy could ski. He loved skiing, but no matter how much he tried to persuade Nicole, she never agreed to such forest walks. She would pout and complain. Well, Neil, what have you come up with? What kind of rustic fun is this? You might as well invite me to go sledding. And he would have invited her, both for sledding and skating. But Nicole categorically rejected all such entertainment. Go alone, was her response. And if you went alone, she would sulk for a week. It always bothered Neil, but he never showed it. With Wendy, he felt good. He enjoyed watching her concentrated skiing and how her eyes lit up childishly when they encountered a fluffy squirrel swinging on a branch. "There, you fell over there." Neil pointed with his pole and cheerfully looked into her eyes. Wendy blushed and pretended to brush snow off her gloves. Neil smiled but didn't continue to embarrass her. Although he remembered every detail from that evening, he was used to Nicole's sweet sense. But Wendy exuded freshness and purity. Strange. Why did he often think of her? It seemed like everything in his life was already settled. There was Nicole, whom he had been dating for 2 years. They didn't live together, though. Nicole wanted to move her things, but he dissuaded her, citing his night work that would disturb her sleep. Despite everything, Neil admitted bitterly that it seemed Nicole dreamed more about the ceremony than the family itself. She wanted a beautiful dress, an unusual ceremony venue, gifts, and attention. 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 Neil acknowledged all this with bitterness, but for some reason, he went along with it. "Did she cast a spell on me?" He smirked. What nonsense. Unexpectedly, a snowball flew into his back, followed by another hitting his shoulder. Neil turned around, saw Wendy laughing while gathering a new batch of snow with her mittens. Her face was cheerful, and her eyes mischievous. "Oh, I see." Neil quickly fashioned a snowball and threw it back at Wendy. It scattered, hitting her leg. As if remembering childhood, Neil and Wendy started pelting each other with snow. They unhooked their skis and began chasing each other among the trees, plunging into deep drifts, and everyone was laughing. Finally, Wendy stopped under a tall fir tree to catch her breath. Neil jumped closer and pulled a branch hanging above the girl. Snow immediately fell on Wendy. She looked like a snowman. She glared in protest, but couldn't help bursting into laughter. Neil carefully brushed the snow off her hat and scarf. His cheeks suddenly felt warm, and his hands trembled slightly. Wendy's face was right next to his. He could feel her breath, see the fluffy lashes, and gaze at her naturally beautiful lips. Without thinking clearly about what he was about to do, Neil leaned in to kiss her, but she pushed both hands against his chest, staring at him with frightened eyes. He stopped, then lowered his head and stepped back. An awkward silence hung in the air, spoiling the mood of this unusual winter day. They returned in silence. Wendy walked behind Neil, glaring at his back, furious with him. Why did he ruin everything? Her heart alternated between joy and caution, whispering, "He has a fiancé, and to him, you're just entertainment out of boredom." At home, Wendy resumed her usual duties and then stayed in George's office to help him go through the journals. She delved so deeply into the academic's past and family history that she didn't even notice evening setting in. At night, before sleep, she wondered why Neil increasingly found himself near her. The lazy winter weekdays flowed quietly. Neil didn't invite her for a work anymore, and after the failed kiss, it seemed like he was avoiding her altogether. Wendy sadly looked at the uneaten sweet picture on the windowsill. So, maybe it was all in her imagination. Soon, Nicole arrived, and the house immediately filled with the sweet scent of oriental perfumes. Chairs rattled, dishes clinked, and the TV loudly chattered. Nicole didn't leave Neil's side for a minute. Wendy tried to cross their paths less often, yet sometimes she caught the resentful, piercing gaze of the girl, as if she were guilty of something in front of her. One day, Patricia called Wendy to help her organize the dressing room. They needed to sort through the jewelry and arrange various brooches in their designated places. Patricia had been collecting many items since her youth, including small but valuable antique pieces. "This," Patricia said, taking out a heavy lacy bracelet, "my father gave me for finishing school." Wendy admired the various shades of gold, marveling at the beauty and elegance of the piece. "Here," the homeowner continued, "our wedding rings with George. Our fingers have swollen. We can't wear them anymore," she sighed, "but we'll be buried with them. I want to put all the most precious things in the box you gave me as a gift," smiled the elderly lady. They did just that. and they sorted and polished the remaining jewelry, setting aside the silver for cleaning. Soon, Patricia went off to rest, and Wendy promised to finish the work. She enjoyed looking at their antique jewelry. On the dresser was a black and white photograph of a young Patricia with pearls around her neck and earrings in her ears. The same ones Wendy now saw in a separate case. Unexpectedly, George fell ill the next day. Nothing serious, just a slight cold. But Wendy's schedule was disrupted from its usual rhythm. She didn't mind. On the contrary, she was deeply concerned for their old man and tried to check in on him extra times to see if he needed anything. By night, George had fallen asleep, and Wendy, after adjusting the blanket, quietly left the room. As she approached the small staircase leading to her attic, Nicole hurriedly descended from there. Wendy stared at her in surprise, expecting an explanation of why she needed to go upstairs. I was just looking for a book. I left it on the living room table yesterday, Nicole said. It was evident she was nervous, but in a matter of seconds, she composed herself and casually added, I thought maybe you took it to read. She smiled and quickly walked towards the staircase. Black hair flickered, and Nicole disappeared downstairs. She was so tired after this long day of worrying about George that all she dreamed of was reaching her bed. So she paid no attention to Nicole's strange explanation. Instead, she became curious about Wendy's life. Entering Wendy's room, she scanned it. Everything seemed normal. Wendy quickly changed into her pajamas, wrapped herself in a blanket, and fell asleep. The next morning, after breakfast, Neil and Nicole left, promising to return in the evening. Just 2 hours later, a pale Patricia called Judy to help her search the room. Whispering and exchanging words quietly, exclamations were heard, and it seemed like there was a soft crying and sobbing. Wendy began to feel uneasy. What could have happened? George didn't get worse. On the contrary, he had breakfast with appetite today. No calls or bad news either. And suddenly, my heart started pounding anxiously. Maybe something happened to Neil. Wendy went up to Patricia and knocked softly. Peeking in, she saw 2 women with distraught faces digging through the dressing room. Old drawers were pulled out, and there was disorder on the table. Patricia, Judy, what happened? Patricia turned with a tear-stained face. Yes, dear, the box with the bracelet is missing. And the rings, mine and George's. Wendy, not understanding, looked around. But how? Maybe you moved them somewhere. Remember, Patricia. The old lady sobbed and shook her head. No, dear, no. They were right here, where we searched together. That's where I left them. Heaton arrived, pushed the dresser, delved under the drawers, looked into the wardrobe, checked all the shelves, and even peeked behind the books. The box was nowhere to be found. Oh, just don't tell George, Patricia said in a half whisper. He'll be upset. His blood pressure will spike. Oh, just keep quiet. Judy settled the old lady in a chair and went for calming drops. Wendy contemplated. Where could the box be? What about Neil? Did you call Neil? Maybe there was silver there too. Remember, we were going to clean it. Maybe he took it and brought it to the jeweler. Patricia immediately called her grandson. She told him about the loss. Neil was surprised, assured that he hadn't taken anything, and advised not to worry. He would be back in the evening, and they would search together. Surely, Grandma just forgot where she put it. It happens, but Patricia was inconsolable, and it was impossible to suspect her of inattention. She possessed a photographic memory and had retained this ability even in old age. The whole day went awry. They had lunch without appetite, offering new versions of what happened. By evening, Neil and Nicole returned. Neil immediately began to reassure his grandmother and went to inspect the room. Nicole showed no particular sympathy. She sat on the armrest of the chair, silently observing the commotion. A mysterious smile played on her face, as if the girl eagerly awaited the unfolding events. Well, I don't know, Patricia sadly said. Some kind of mystique. Disappeared as if it never was. We need to check other rooms, suddenly said Nicole, squinting out the window. Everyone turned to her, puzzled. Nicole calmly surveyed them all and then pointed at Wendy. Yesterday, I saw your assistant carrying some shiny wooden box into her room. I even thought she took my book. You can expect anything from her. Nicole, Patricia and Neil exclaimed in unison. Wendy, stunned, stared at Nicole. This is not true, she said quietly. The nightmare of accusations of theft appeared before her again. I didn't take anything. Neil frowned and turned away. Judy froze, pressing both palms to her mouth. Patricia shook her head, not wanting to listen to nonsense. Nicole, dear, what are you doing? Wendy couldn't. The old lady tried to defend her. Oh, do you think so? As far as I know, a similar situation happened to her at her previous job. Let's just check. And if I'm wrong, I'll apologize. Nicole smiled sweetly and approached. Wendy felt her hands trembling. Unjust accusations left her mouth dry, and she couldn't say anything in her defense. Nicole, I think you're going too far, Neil suddenly said. He saw Wendy's condition and couldn't believe that this innocent girl could do such a thing. It's impossible. Anyone but Wendy. Nothing is too far. If she has nothing to fear, let her show her room. Nicole shrugged. If everyone is so reluctant to offend the maid, I can go with her. It's not a big deal. Nicole headed towards the stairs. Wendy scanned the room with her eyes. She thought everyone would protest and stop this, whatever this girl who hated her was doing. But no one looked at Wendy. Patricia cried, and Neil comforted her, and even Judy averted her gaze. Judy, Wendy pleaded. So what? Shall we go? Nicole's black eyes stared without blinking. Suddenly, a mix of disappointment and anger overwhelmed Wendy. Why was this malicious creature accusing her? Wendy abruptly left her place and almost ran upstairs, with Nicole hurrying after her. Look, search, Wendy shouted, opening the door to the attic. Nicole smirked and entered the room. She pulled out the drawers of the dresser and, wrinkling her nose in disgust, sifted through Wendy's things with long fingers. Then she looked into the wardrobe. Wendy was shaking. She barely held back, watching Nicole try to find something that wasn't here and never had been. After a moment of contemplation in the center of the room, Nicole lifted a pillow and then, turning around, approached the trunk. Before opening the lid, she turned and looked at Wendy triumphantly, and Wendy understood everything. She gasped and stared in amazement at the girl, who nodded affirmatively and smiled widely, revealing impeccably white teeth. Well, Nicole exclaimed triumphantly, quickly flipping open the lid and taking out the box. Let's check if everything is in place, she said mockingly, taunting Wendy. I didn't take it, Wendy suddenly exclaimed. You planted it, didn't you? Wendy turned around and saw Neil in the doorway. She locked eyes with him and saw astonishment, pain, and disgust in his eyes. Tears streamed down Wendy's cheeks. She cried uncontrollably. This is not true. It's not me. Why would I? She exclaimed. Well, you didn't believe me, Nicole calmly said, handing the box to Neil and leaving the attic. Neil, it's not true. I saw Nicole coming out of my room. I don't know what she was doing there. Honestly, believe me, Wendy cried. I would never. Neil, are you coming? A voice from the stairs echoed. Why are you talking to her again? Of course, she'll come up with 1,000 excuses. Patricia, everything is fine. The box has been found, Nicole said loudly, descending the stairs. Watching Wendy cry, Neil pursed his lips, turned, and left. Wendy threw herself on the bed and burst into tears. Everything good that happened to her in the last few months was now overshadowed. Wendy didn't sleep the entire night. She either cried or sat on the bed, hugging her knees, staring into space. How did she end up being accused of theft again? She remembered how Neil looked at her, how much regret was in his eyes. She envisioned the eyes of Patricia, Judy, George, Heaton, and even Lumpy's eyes. How could she prove that she didn't do it? No way. There was no way to prove it. Wendy slumped her shoulders and fell silent powerlessly. She didn't leave the room in the morning. She listened to the sounds that filled the house. The loud laughter of Nicole and her cheerful exclamations cut through her soul like a knife. Nothing would change here if she, Wendy, disappeared. It would only bring peace to everyone. A quiet knock on the door, and Judy brought breakfast. Wendy lay on the bed, facing the wall. The aroma of coffee and toast filled the air. Wendy didn't move. Judy sat next to her. The springs creaked faintly. The woman looked worriedly at the girl she had brought into the house, not knowing what to say or do. She sighed and touched Wendy's shoulder. "Wendy, eat, and we'll see from there." Wendy sat up abruptly, hitting her head against the wall. Judy recoiled. The girl's face was scary to look at, pale, with feverish gleaming eyes and bruises underneath. "What will we see, Judy?" "What?" Wendy asked. Judy remained silent, examining her hands. Wendy understood her silence and covered her face with her palms. She didn't leave the room all day. Wendy didn't eat a single bite. A lump with sharp spikes seemed stuck in her throat. It didn't let her swallow and hindered taking a deep breath. Her chest hurt. When she was accused of theft in the hospital, it didn't hurt so much. She didn't know those people. But here, now, everyone thinks she repaid kindness with betrayal. Late in the evening, Patricia entered. Seeing the distressed expression on the old woman's face, Wendy gathered all the courage left in her and spoke, looking directly into her eyes. She didn't avert her gaze. Patricia had a kind soul and a bright heart. She had to understand that Wendy was not guilty of anything before her. Wendy spoke hesitantly, and her main desire was not to preserve her position, but to try to prove that she hadn't betrayed their trust. She thought no more about herself, but about the elderly and Judy. What was it like for them to realize that they had made such a cruel mistake and let a thief into the house? No, she needed to at least try to convince them that their good deed was not in vain, and she had already decided everything for herself. The next day, Wendy left her room and resumed her duties. She visited George, and the household kept their old man, not telling him about what had happened. "Why are you pale, Wendy? And as if you've been crying. Come on. Who is this scoundrel who dared to offend the kindest girl on earth?" George joked, "I'll give him a piece of my mind." Wendy smiled, swallowing the approaching tears, making light of the situation. Exiting their office, she bumped into Neil. He muttered something indistinct and walked on. Nicole passed by and said, "Thank me for not reporting you to the police, you beggar." Wendy clenched her lips and went down to the kitchen. She decided to check her suspicions and looked into the drawer where Judy kept money for household needs. The envelope was not in its usual place. Wendy understood that now they didn't trust her here. In the yard, voices were heard. Neil and Nicole were leaving for the city. Wendy approached the window and, hiding behind the curtain, watched as Nicole hugged Patricia, waving to them. Inside, it hurt as if a live blade was cutting through her. In the evening, she had dinner alone in the kitchen and went up to her room. Taking her bag out of the closet, she packed her things and, pulling a sheet of paper from the notebook, began writing a letter. She didn't want to leave without saying goodbye. She reiterated that she would never dare to commit such a disgusting act. She sincerely thanked them for their attention and care. She asked them not to worry about her because she had decided to go home. She secretly ordered a taxi, asking to stop on the next street to avoid waking up their entire house. Finally, casting a sad glance around the room, she quietly worked out the door. In the cottage, silence prevailed. Wendy descended the stairs, pausing for a moment when one of the steps creaked. In the living room, she lingered. All the coals in the fireplace were smoldering. and only Lumpy lay on the rug, savoring the last warmth. Sensing Wendy, he lifted his head and immediately approached her. He nudged her hand with his cold and moist nose, as if asking, "Where are you going so late?" Wendy affectionately stroked his head, whispering, "SHH, Lumpy. Just be quiet." What cruel fate had been haunting her all her life? Was it not enough that she lost her parents so early, and then her grandmother? She hadn't done anything wrong to anyone or anything, yet misfortunes kept raining down on her. She walked to the dining table and placed her farewell letter in the center. Judy would definitely see it first thing in the morning. She glanced around once more, quickly put on her jacket, and stepped out onto the porch, firmly closing the door behind her. Neil's scarf, a gift, remained hanging on the rack. Lampy barked softly in her wake, but fell silent immediately. The taxi carried her to the station. Darkness surrounded her outside, and tears streamed down the girl's cheeks again. She couldn't sleep on the train, reminiscing about how happy she had been in George and Patricia's home. Now she was absolutely sure that Nicole had framed her with the jewelry box. But how could Wendy prove it? In the morning, Judy and Patricia bombarded her phone with calls. There were 2 calls from an unknown number, but then everything fell silent. The house she returned to greeted her with coldness. Nothing had changed. "Oh, Wendy," said a neighbor when he saw Wendy opening her apartment. "You're back. Some old man came looking for you. He left a phone number. Asked to call when you show up." Wendy looked at the neighbor in surprise. "What old man?" Suddenly her heart raced. It must be Mr. Corduroy. But how did he find her? Why did he come? And where did he get a phone? Gray hair, dark eyes. The girl impatiently asked. "What?" He replied. "Where's the note?" "Give it to me, please," Wendy requested. "Hold on," he exclaimed. There was joy and surprise in his voice. A minute later, the neighbor appeared again, holding a crumpled piece of paper in his hand. Wendy thanked him and entered her apartment. She looked around sadly, recalling her cozy attic with curtains, a striped rug on the floor, and a chest in the corner. Unfolding the sheet, she saw a large but beautiful handwriting. It was amazing that this seemingly crazy old man could write so neatly and without mistakes. "Dear Wendy, this is Mr. Corduroy. I've been discharged from the hospital and really want to thank you for your kindness. Please call me at this phone number. Make sure you do. Wendy read." "I don't understand anything," the girl thought. If he has nowhere to live, where could he get a mobile phone? It's all strange. She read the short message again and froze. "Well, I'll call. It won't hurt. Maybe nobody will even answer," Wendy decided. She didn't want to ignore the old man's request, and a faint hope emerged. Perhaps everything had changed, and he had found relatives, and now he wasn't alone. She took out her phone, dialed Mr. Corduroy's number while doubting he would answer. "Hello," she heard the familiar voice say. "Hello, I'm listening." "Mr. Corduroy, hello. This is Wendy. You left your phone number and asked to call you. I'm the nurse who..." "Wendy," Mr. Corduroy interrupted her. "Oh, dear. How glad I am that you called. They told me you left, and I thought that was it." Wendy could hear that their old man was very agitated. "Yes, I was leaving, but now I had to come back. I'm glad you've recovered, Mr. Corduroy," Wendy replied. "And I was glad to hear you." "Wait," the old man shouted. "Wendy, wait. We need to meet. Talk. I'd like to thank you. You know, it's impossible to explain over the phone. Tell me, can we meet right now?" "Yes, Mr. Corduroy. I can meet with you now. Where is it convenient for you?" "Write down the address, Wendy. Just be sure to write it down so you don't get confused." Wendy smiled and got ready to write. Strange. This is a special area. There are such rich houses there, she thought, unless the old man deliberately wandered there in the hope of being fed and given alms. No, He doesn't seem like someone who would do that. He looks too proud. Wendy thought. Her heart told her the old man had once led an ordinary life. Perhaps something unfortunate happened later. They agreed to meet in 2 hours. Wendy prepared to go to the other end of the city. She walked for a long time on an unfamiliar street in search of the house she needed. Finally, tall fences and 2 cameras came into view. The girl looked around, but there was no sign of Mr. Corduroy. Taking out the piece of paper with the address, she double-checked. Everything was correct. Then, a melodic sound from the intercom echoed, and the small door swung open. There stood Mr. Corduroy, smiling joyfully at Wendy. In that initial moment, she didn't even recognize the old man she last saw in the hospital ward. Now, he resembled a venerable scientist from the Academy of Sciences, with a halo of gray hair around his bald head and a high forehead. His cheerful dark brown eyes sparkled behind thin golden-rimmed glasses. "Mr. Corduroy, is that you? I could hardly recognize you," Wendy exclaimed. "Come in, Wendy. Come in, dear," Mr. Corduroy said. "How wonderful that you are found. I almost gave up hope." He opened the gate and pulled Wendy by the sleeve. She hesitated and stopped. "But, Mr. Corduroy, how did you end up here?" The old man chuckled. "Don't worry, Wendy. I'm here legally. Let's go to my place, and I'll explain everything." Wendy followed the old man along the tiled path. Decorative fir trees with green cones surrounded them. Further on, an inactive fountain came into view. Even further were lawns partially covered with a thin layer of snow. In front of her stood a 2-story stone house. Wendy glanced timidly at the gleaming marble staircase and the huge terrace. Mr. Corduroy continued along the path and turned behind trimmed bushes. There, a small 1-story house, divided into 2 halves, emerged. "These are my riches, Wendy," Mr. Corduroy laughed. Baffled, Wendy followed Mr. Corduroy. She was eager to hear how he ended up here. Inside the house, there was a small room and a tiny kitchen. The old man seated Wendy on the couch and started boiling a kettle while retrieving cookies and candies from the cupboard. Wendy felt embarrassed, but Mr. Corduroy insisted. He peered out from the kitchen, as if afraid Wendy would disappear again, just like she did from the hospital. That scoundrel, Dr. Reed, paid for it. He was fired. All his schemes were exposed. Out of pity, they left him as an ordinary doctor until the first warning, Mr. Corduroy explained. Wendy widened her eyes. Amazing news like that. Finally, Mr. Corduroy poured the tea and settled down, sitting next to Wendy. She took a sip of the hot tea, feeling warmth spread through her body. She was quite cold from wandering the streets. "Where were you, Wendy? Where did you disappear to?" Mr. Corduroy asked. He attempted to take a sip, but grimaced and set the cup aside to cool. He gazed attentively into his guest's eyes. "I left, Mr. Corduroy, on business." Wendy reached for a cookie, trying to distract herself from tearing up. "To your parents?" The old man continued his questioning. Wendy shook her head, biting her lower lip. Then, as if making up her mind, she said, "No, I have no one. My parents and grandma passed away. I was raised in an orphanage. And then I rented the apartment you visited." "That's not a nice place," Mr. Corduroy frowned. "And the neighbors? Not very good neighbors." Wendy smiled. It was amusing that someone cared about her. "It's all right, Mr. Corduroy. One can live there." "One can," the old man said. He clapped his hands on his knees, lost in thought. Wendy remained silent. She perked up and smiled at the disheartened man. "And you? How did you end up here, Mr. Corduroy? You promised to tell me," she inquired. The old man smoothed his short gray hair with his hand. "Luck, Wendy. Just luck. First, you, like a guardian angel, took pity on me, though it's not a sin at all. Is helping a sin? And then, Tom Quinlan, my former student, crossed my path. Quinlan, Wendy said in surprise. Yes, the mayor. I didn't know how high he climbed, given how lazy he used to be. I'm a math teacher, Mr. Corduroy explained. He fell silent for a moment. And then, when you left, Tom came to the hospital with an inspection. And for some reason, he went through the wards. And there I was. That's how this Dr. Reed got caught. The old man chuckled. They quickly transferred me to another hospital, got me back on my feet. When I was discharged, I rushed to see you, but you were gone. I thought it was all over, and I wouldn't be able to thank you. And here, what are you doing here? Wendy asked impatiently. This is also Tom's doing. Understand, Wendy, my apartment was taken away deceitfully, not here, in another city. Then they moved me somewhere and left me stranded. That's how I ended up here. It was shameful, powerless in my old age and homeless. Mr. Corduroy shook his head. I had to open up to Tom. Since he's in charge, I thought maybe he could help me get my apartment back. Scammers worked there. And I, an old fool, signed something without really looking. They said it was documents for an increased pension for years of service, claiming all teachers and doctors were entitled to it. Turns out, I signed a general power of attorney. That's it. Lost everything due to my own stupidity. Tried going to the police, but the old man waved his hand. No help. I would have died in a ditch if not for kind people. What about relatives? Family? Wendy asked. She felt sorry for the unfortunate and deceived Mr. Corduroy. What kind of heart did these people have to throw a defenseless old man out on the street? I have no one. Wendy. The man lowered his head. Just like you. My wife died. Had a daughter. Yes. He coughed and quickly changed the subject. And Tom was looking for a tutor for his son. Exactly then. The lad is a bit mischievous. He needs the right approach. So, Tom persuaded me to give it a try. You know, Wendy, everything turned out well. Even with his mischief. Simon and I got along. And Tom pays me. So, he settled me for now. I tried to refuse, but he wouldn't listen. Raised his voice. Said he's the boss. The mayor. There you have it. Obliged to obey. Mr. Corduroy chuckled quietly. Despite his grumbling, it was evident that the old man was content with his current situation. Well, as for the apartment, I'll go to Wendy's place. And here's what I've been thinking. Maybe you could come with me. I have a 2-bedroom apartment, very nice and bright. Wendeline, my wife, and I lived there. And our daughter. Wendy smiled, as if remembering something. My mom used to call me that sometimes too. More often Wendy, of course, but I definitely remember Wendeline as well. We always wondered where she got that from. The old man stared at her face intently, his eyes seeming to lose their luster. It was clear that he had drifted far away into his memories. But suddenly, as if awakening, he blinked and reached out to Wendy. He gently took her hand in his palm, and the magical sensation of something familiar and warm enveloped her from head to toe. Let's go together. Both of us are orphans, so let's help each other. And the apartment will be yours eventually. The city is big. You'll quickly find a job for yourself. And, dear, you should consider going back to school. I can see you're smart. Where will I find a job, Mr. Corduroy? Wendy smiled. Dr. Reed dismissed me in disgrace. Who would hire me? Don't worry. Everything can be fixed. You can file a lawsuit and get compensation for moral damages. Can you kick someone out for mercy, for a kind heart? And, in general, demand that this former head apologizes to you publicly. Let television film it. You can sue for slander. Wendy, her eyes widening, looked at the old man. Seeing his reddened face and eyes burning with righteous anger, she got scared that his blood pressure might spike. All right, Mr. Corduroy. All right. She started calming him down. I'll think about it. Nothing is clear yet. Please don't worry. Wendy spent a long time in Mr. Corduroy's cozy home. He rejoiced in her presence like a child, entertaining her with funny stories from his school days and comically demonstrating how his students used to play tricks on him. There were playful sparks in his eyes. How wonderful it is when a person loves their work so much. It's a calling. Wendy smiled. Her parents were the same. Someday, I'll find something I love doing. The girl dreamed. The day outside gradually turned gray, and Wendy became anxious. She needed to get home before it got completely dark. Her neighborhood wasn't very safe even during the day. Mr. Corduroy squinted and raised his eyebrows. Wait a moment. He stood up and went somewhere. Wendy patiently waited for his return, anxiously calculating whether she could make it home before it got pitch dark. There was a knock on the door. Mr. Corduroy returned, not alone but with a tall man dressed in a casual sweater and jeans. Smiling with white teeth, he extended his hand to Wendy. Pleasure to meet you, Wendy. I'm Tom. Nice to meet you. Wendy looked in astonishment at the man who governed an entire town. She couldn't have imagined even in her dreams that she would find herself in the same room with him. Mr. Corduroy told me about you. I'm glad you're back. Don't worry about work. We'll definitely find a place for you. Although, I know Mr. Corduroy is trying to persuade you to leave with him. But, the man raised a pointed finger. Firstly, it's not entirely clear when everything will be settled with the apartment. And secondly, my Simon won't survive without you. We can study through the computer in our time. Is that a problem? Mr. Corduroy shrugged. It was evident that this argument between them was not happening for the first time. Tom smirked and patted the old man on the shoulder. Wendy had a hard time falling asleep that night. She kept recalling the wonderful day that, at least a little, smoothed the bitterness of recent events. The next morning, the hospital's human resources department called her to come in. They spent a long time drafting orders, making changes. All this time, Wendy patiently waited in the corridor. Familiar nurses and attendants ran past her. Some nodded, silently greeting her, while others simply averted their eyes. Wendy felt no triumph. On the contrary, she wanted to leave these gloomy walls as soon as possible. Although she was grateful to the plague house, it was here that the chain of events began, introducing her to Mr. Corduroy, and eventually leading to Flynn's cozy cottage. Several days had passed since her escape, and dark eyes, straight broad brows, and lips reaching out to kiss her kept resurfacing in her memory. She shook her head, trying to rid herself of the memories, but they refused to let go. Resentment gripped her. The hospital acknowledged their injustice, but in Flynn's home, she would be remembered as a thief who wormed her way into trust. Wendy. A loud voice pulled the girl out of her bitter thoughts. She raised her head and smiled joyfully. From the depths of the corridor, Mrs. Loire, tapping her way, hurried towards her. Mrs. Loire. Wendy jumped up and, spreading her arms, rushed to embrace her. I heard the girls saying Wendy is here. I didn't believe it at first. And you're really here. Oh, how glad I am, dear. The whole hospital is buzzing. All the manipulations of the bosses have come to light. They left Dr. Reed for now, removed him from his position but left him. You know, Mrs. Loire nudged Wendy in the side. Our hero has slimmed down, apparently from worry. He slimmed down and burst into loud laughter. Laughing, she continued, and Denise quit right away. She didn't wait to see if she'd be next or not. Reed even fretted about it. Like, how is this possible? After all, she swore eternal love to him. And then, from the direction of the stairs, Dr. Reed's figure appeared. He didn't look well. Seeing Wendy, he flinched, turned away, and quickly walked away. You see, he's afraid to look into your eyes now, Mrs. Loire sighed. Wendy embraced her again and nuzzled her nose into the disinfectant-scented gown that had gone missing. How lucky she was that a few months ago, Mrs. Loire, seemingly rough, supported and sympathized with her. "Thank you, Mrs. Loire, for helping." The voice choked. Tears welled up in her throat. Wendy hastily opened her purse and pulled out a prepared envelope. She had long wanted to give Mrs. Loire the money. Thanks to Flynn, she managed to save up. Where else would she spend it? Memories resurfaced, and Wendy even closed her eyes. The wound was still too fresh. "What's wrong with you?" Mrs. Loire exclaimed in alarm. "No, I won't take it." She pushed the envelope away with her hand. "But, Mrs. Loire, if it weren't for you, you helped me so much. Please," Wendy said sincerely. "I earned it. I have it. Please take it." Mrs. Loire resisted a little more, but eventually took the money. "They're closing us down in the summer," she informed. "Repairs will be done. The mayor came and arranged everything. So, we're being transferred to the 6th hospital. And those who don't want to can take a 3-month vacation. And I'm thinking," Mrs. Loire even blushed with pleasure, "I'm thinking of going to my sister in the East." "Ha, Wendy, what do you think? It's warm there, but most importantly there's the sea." "Of course, go, Mrs. Loire," exclaimed Wendy. "Definitely go." A week later, Wendy enrolled in massage courses and immersed herself in the study of anatomy and massage techniques. Classes took place in one of the private medical centers. Wendy often visited Mr. Corduroy. She sat in the room, drank tea, and listened to his stories. She desperately wanted to ask him about his daughter, but she was afraid. She saw the pain in the old man's eyes when he even briefly mentioned her. She saw how it tormented him, eating him up from the inside. Sometimes she wondered why she felt so good with her old teacher. She remembered how the same warmth came from her grandmother Rita, and she also wanted to be with her all the time. But then she was a little girl, and now, what connects her with Mr. Corduroy is unclear. Spring came. Wendy adored spring. Everything comes alive, blooms, leaving the most challenging things behind. And in the spring, it was her birthday. She wanted to spend this day with a dear person. So Wendy invited Mr. Corduroy to her place. She prepared 2 salads, baked a charlotte, and bought ice cream. Mr. Corduroy arrived on time, wearing a suit and tie. In his hands, he held a bouquet of daffodils. Wendy placed the flowers in a vase right in the center of the table, and their delicate scent immediately filled the room. Mr. Corduroy fidgeted, took a long, flat box from his inner pocket. Nervously, he opened it. Wendy gasped. Inside, on velvety fabric, lay a lovely bracelet adorned with blue stones. Enchanted by its beauty, the girl decisively shook her head. "No, Mr. Corduroy, I can't accept such an expensive gift." The old man blushed, cleared his throat, and then spoke. "Wendy, dear, it's from the bottom of my heart. In memory of me, I believe this stone suits you well. It's turquoise. In Tibet, this stone was considered a divine creation. Its Persian name translates as bringer of victory. I would like this stone to give you strength, to make everything work out for you, and that anything bad couldn't even come close." Wendy smiled with trembling lips and, sobbing, hugged Mr. Corduroy. He gently stroked her back, discreetly wiping the tears that welled up in her eyes. "Well, why are we crying here?" the old man said. "Let's eat already." They drank tea for a long time. Wendy talked about her parents, reminiscing about how her mother sang songs to her and took her to work at the library. Mr. Corduroy listened attentively, occasionally seeming surprised. "You know, my mom also loved jewelry with blue stones, especially one, an antique ring. It was on her, on that day." Wendy sighed. She stood up and took a small box from the drawer. Inside were her childhood photos, pictures of her parents and grandmother, everything that relatives managed to preserve while she was in the orphanage. There was also a small pouch with the ring. Without understanding why, Wendy suddenly wanted to share her past with her guest. She hadn't even taken the photos in her hand when Mr. Corduroy gasped and clutched his right side. Large drops of sweat appeared on his forehead. Wendy was scared. "Mr. Corduroy, are you okay? What's wrong? Your heart? I'll call an ambulance right now." She grabbed the phone from the table. But the old man rose and grabbed her hand. "No, no doctors. It will pass. It will pass now." Wendy poured water and SAT next to him, holding the glass in her hand. Mr. Corduroy breathed heavily, but it was noticeable that the attack was gradually weakening. "Don't be scared, Wendy," he said with effort. "Just me. Where did you get these photos?" "Well, of course," Wendy said perplexedly. "I told you. These are my parents and grandmother. Here's the ring." She turned the pouch, and in her palm lay a memory of her mother, darkened by fire and time. Mr. Corduroy took the ring with trembling fingers and looked inside it. "This is it. My God. Stella." The old man shook in silent tears. Wendy opened her mouth in amazement. How does he know her mom's name? Suddenly, Mr. Corduroy hugged Wendy tightly. "Granddaughter, Wendy, you were named after my mother. Stella means, oh, I'm old. Why didn't I recognize you right away? I saw the resemblance but thought it was a coincidence. Oh, how guilty I am, Wendy. Before you, before your mother, before everyone. I have no forgiveness. This sin will be with me forever." Wendy sat there, still as a plastic doll, unable to move. She couldn't believe that Mr. Corduroy was her grandfather. Could such a thing be possible? Whenever little Wendy asked about her other grandma and grandpa, her mom remained silent. In those moments, her dad would stroke her mom's hair, gently squeeze her shoulder, and Wendy would be led away into another room. There, he would try to distract her with a game. But the girl could hear her mom crying softly. Mr. Corduroy wiped his reddened eyes with his hand. Wendy waited for him to calm down completely so he could tell her everything that happened many years ago. "It was a long time ago, Wendy," Mr. Corduroy began. 20 years have passed. We lived together, my wife Wensline, Stella, and I. We lived well. Stella was in 7th grade when her mother died. We were left alone, just the two of us. I went crazy. I was so afraid of losing her. How could I go on alone? I wouldn't let her take a step without me. I thought that was the only way to be sure everything would be okay with her. Stella was angry. Of course, the old man weakly smiled. Who would like it? 17 years old. And her father was always around. No going out with friends. No dating. But I was scared. You know, Wendy. I was scared. Mr. Corduroy stood up and walked to the window. It was hard for him to look into the eyes of his granddaughter, who, because of him, endured the hardships and ended up in an orphanage with strangers. Even when rumors of his daughter's death reached him, he either didn't believe or didn't want to believe it. How was it possible that his Stella just disappeared? Stella fell in love, and I didn't like the guy. He seemed like a fool, an outsider with nothing. Was that the future I wished for my daughter? I saw a potential suitor for her, the son of my friend. He was advancing in the diplomatic field, and he was interested in Stella. We had so many arguments, so many scandals, but Stella never wanted to give up and leave her Philip. She always told me, I love Philip. I'll be with him anyway. I got angry, of course, and when Philip left for studies, I watched all his letters, took and threw them away. It hurt to see Stella like that. She was so sad. And I even provoked her, said that Philip abandoned you, and Stella cried. Mr. Corduroy clenched his fists. I would give anything now to go back there. Not a single tear of hers would I allow. Yes, it's too late. I'm grateful you found us, Wendy. But will you forgive me? And what happened next? Wendy asked softly. Philip came back, and I managed to beat Stella to it. I met him at the train station, and immediately told him that Stella was getting married and didn't intend to see him anymore. What did this old fool hope for? Of course, everything was explained quickly, the discarded letters, the lies about Stella. And 2 days later, I came back late. There was a meeting at the administration, but no Stella. Just a note on the table saying she left with Philip. She gathered some things, took the mother's ring, and left. I went crazy. I wanted to know where she could have gone. And then I nearly cursed her. The old man lowered his head. I decided I no longer had a daughter if she chose some uncouth boy over me, her own father. Pride spoke in me, and I couldn't handle it. And now here's the reckoning. Mr. Corduroy uttered these words with such pain, with such suffering, that Wendy couldn't bait and approached him. She gently embraced the old man. Don't cry. No one is to blame. Mr. Corduroy choked back a sob and turned to Wendy. With trembling hands, he stroked her hair and held her tightly, as if afraid that Wendy might disappear, just like his disobedient but beloved daughter once did. If only he had agreed with her choice immediately, she wouldn't have had to run away and lay alive in a wooden house that ignited like a match, burning in an instant, consuming not only bodies but also the souls of loved ones. What a blessing that she left behind a thread that would now forever connect him with his lost daughter. Mom never spoke ill of you, Wendy whispered. She missed you. Even though I was little, I remember her eyes when I asked about you. I missed her too, and I still do, sighed Mr. Corduroy. Well, now I definitely have to go with you. Wendy smiled to comfort her grandfather. Otherwise, who will look after you? They laughed together. In the evening, when Mr. Corduroy went home, Wendy sat by the window for a long time. Wendy was smiling. What a precious gift she received on her birthday. She was not alone now. The feeling of a vast emptiness, where suddenly and instantly she found herself in childhood, gradually faded. Warmth of a loved one was again beside her. She was happy to have waited for him. 2 months later, Mr. Corduroy's housing issue was resolved, and he was preparing to go home. I'll go, see what's there, and how it is. Repairs will be needed, he told Wendy. Tom promised to help. He wanted to give me money, but I refused. We agreed that after the renovation, I'll work with Simon for free for 6 months. As if I took an advance from him. And you, granddaughter, slowly start packing your things. I'll come back for you, and we'll go together. Wendy listened to her grandfather and nodded obediently. Mr. Corduroy couldn't live a day without her now. He called her several times a day and visited her. She also often visited him, mostly after her classes. She had joined massage courses and had to take exams, but Wendy managed it. Golden head, her grandfather affectionately said. Just like your mother. His eyes clouded with tears again. You know, Wendy, I think your mother guided you to me in the hospital, like my guardian angel. How else is this even possible? Oh, Stella, Mr. Corduroy shook his head. No matter how much Wendy assured him that her mother harbored no resentment toward him, the heaviness in his soul didn't lift. He prayed only for God to give him strength to live a little longer, to spend time with his granddaughter, to help and protect her. Protect? Wendy laughed. Does that mean I won't be able to get married to whomever I want? No. Her grandfather genuinely panicked. If you love, I won't say a word against it. Wendy's eyes became melancholic. Neil had not left her mind all this time. He haunted her nights. She feared meeting him and simultaneously dreamt of it. She knew it was impossible. Neil, after what happened, wouldn't want to know her. Besides, what did he have left in this tiny town? He wouldn't accidentally come here. Well, fine. Wendy reassured herself, trying to erase his dark eyes and strong hands from her memory. Mr. Corduroy left. Wendy gradually packed her things, placing books in boxes. Mr. Corduroy called every day, boasting about how quickly he was putting his apartment in order. He was pleased that the mess left by the illegal tenants wasn't too devastating. He mentioned not being able to find the photo albums and feared they had been thrown away. One day, he called joyfully, announcing that the missing albums were found on the balcony in boxes. "What happiness, Wendy. I'll show you all the photos. Your grandmother and your little mother." Wendy rejoiced with him. She already envisioned helping her grandfather arrange the house, buying new curtains, creating comfort, and cooking delicious porridge for him in the mornings while listening to his stories. 2 days before leaving, her mother appeared in a dream. She was no longer a swan and stood before Wendy in a long blue dress with bright red poppies adorning the hem. "Wendy," her mother said affectionately, "how happy I am for you, my dear. Your father is happy, and Grandma Rita too." Suddenly, figures of her father and grandmother appeared next to her mother. They smiled warmly, nodded as if bidding farewell, and then all three of them slowly ascended into the air, dissolving into a bright cloud in the heavens. Wendy woke up in tears. The time had come to leave. Wendy persuaded her grandfather to stay home, and she would manage on her own. In the morning, movers arrived and loaded all her belongings into the truck, as directed by Tom. Wendy had already bought a train ticket, and she was just checking if her tickets and documents were in place when she heard a persistent ringing at the door. She listened closely, thinking the movers might have forgotten something. The ringing persisted, demanding attention, as if announcing a fire. After a few seconds, there was a knock on her door. Stunned, Wendy sat on a chair, staring ahead. Breathing suddenly became difficult for some reason. The door creaked open, and Wendy bit her lip harder. Neil stood before her. Seeing her, he smiled and sighed with relief. "Wendy, I'm so glad I caught you." He glanced around the empty apartment, noticed a backpack on a chair, a small travel bag at her feet, and seemed to understand everything. Fear flickered in his eyes for a few more moments, and had he been a bit later, he might not have found Wendy here. Neil stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. "Wendy, I have to explain, apologize to you, and say." Wendy stood up, her knees trembling. The familiar scent of bergamot and citrus gradually filled the room. Neil's face suddenly started to blur, betraying that tears were ready to burst from his eyes. Wendy also had the urge to run to him, hug him, press against his blue shirt, and never leave for a minute. "Forgive me, Wendy. Forgive me for believing Nicole, for not figuring things out. You disappeared so suddenly, and I couldn't find peace. I kept thinking about you all the time, and everyone at home constantly remembered you, only with kind words. Judy, Grandma, all blamed themselves for hurting you unfairly." Staring at Neil in astonishment, Wendy remained silent. She glanced at the clock. It was time to go to the station, or she would be late. But how could she leave when the person she had been thinking about every day for the past few months was standing before her? Neil sensed that Wendy might disappear again and hurried his words. "Grandpa helped, Grandpa." They didn't tell him anything for a long time. Then they had to lie, saying you had urgent matters and needed to leave urgently. And then Grandma couldn't stand it anymore and told him everything. She couldn't deceive him any longer. Grandpa got nervous, cursed terribly that no one asked him from the beginning. Neil lowered his head, and then he gathered everyone in the living room, including Nicole, and told how he couldn't sleep for a long time that night. When Wendy went out for water, he noticed the door opening, saw Nicole emerging from Grandma's office with a small box in her hands. Thinking no one saw her, he saw her go up the stairs to their attic. But he didn't pay much attention to it. Only later did he connect the dots. Nicole tried to deny it, but it was clear to everyone that she was shamelessly lying. She immediately packed up and left. Grandma almost fainted. She can't stand injustice. Judy blamed herself for taking the money from the drawer. She realized you found out about it and got offended at us. That's why she ran away. Wendy, she wasn't hiding the money from you. She just took all of it at once to pay for the delivery by the morning. Please, believe me, it's the truth. Neil fell silent, breathing heavily. Wendy spoke up. But how did you find me? It was Judy. She found the contract, and all the details and the address were there. I rushed here immediately. I was afraid that if I called, you wouldn't want to talk to me and would disappear. We are all very sorry, Wendy. Please forgive us. Silence hung again, and then Neil took a step and held Wendy's hands. And one more thing. I was very miserable without you. I beg you, stay with me. What about Nicole? Neil grimaced and shook his head. It's over with Nicole. I've been with her out of habit for a long time, and I didn't really want to marry her. I just thought I didn't care who would be around. And then I saw you and fell in love, he said almost in a whisper. Wendy smiled and swallowed the lump in her throat. At that moment, Neil cupped her face with both hands and gently kissed her dry lips. Time stood still. The wedding was noisy and romantic, set in the golden September of autumn. Neil and Wendy, shy but infinitely in love, couldn't let go of each other's hands. Cheers, shouted George, reaching for kisses with blushing Patricia. Cheers, echoed Judy and Heaton, clinking glasses. Lampy bounded around with loud barks, stirring up the colorful leaves with his paws, squinting in the sunlight. He seemed eager to pounce on Wendy, licking her face, and she laughed, dodging his playful advances. The dress, as white and lavish as a princess's gown, was not meant to be easily cleaned later. A delicate, translucent veil accentuated the bride's face, her eyes sparkling with love and happiness. Music filled the air, and Mr. Corduroy, wiping away tears, gallantly approached Wendy, inviting her to dance. They twirled slowly, and the weightless veil floated in the air like a wave. "Be happy, my girl," whispered Mr. Corduroy, his eyes once again glistening with tears. Wendy lifted her head to the sky, where endless clouds drifted, some resembling swans.